All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Anne-Marie Slaughter. I am the president and CEO of New America. And I really love this conference because there's no ambiguity about what is going to happen. My notes say you will begin at 8:20. You will speak for 5 minutes. You will not ad lib. This is about the future of war, and we try to do it with military precision. So I do want to start, though, first of all, by saying this is the fourth time we've done this, and it, I think, has really taken on a character of its own, a sense that we have senior leaders from all branches of our armed forces, but we also value this conference as a chance not just to listen and hear, but to engage and to ask tough questions, big questions, and to look into the future. It's also special for New America because of our partnership with Arizona State University. I am an Arizona State evangelist, an unabashed one. I think that Arizona State is reinventing what higher education looks like, and they call themselves the New American University, and we are New America. Our partnership around the future of war means we have a future of war center and classes, and now actually a graduate degree in global security that integrates a lot of the material from this conference. The Future of War project is led by Peter Bergen and Dan Rothenberg. They support our fellows Greg Barker, Josh Geltzer, Azmat Khan, George Packer, Tom Ricks, Rosa Brooks, Dave Kilcullen, and Doug Olivant. That's a pretty great list. They are all Future of War fellows. I'm about to introduce Jim O'Brien, but I have to thank Michael Crow, the visionary president of Arizona State. So we've got a long day ahead of us. We will be looking at specific areas, the Middle East and North Korea, and broad issue areas like cybersecurity and international law, all focused on the future of war. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jim O'Brien, who makes things run at New America, at ASU, and maybe at New America too. He's the Senior Vice President for University Affairs at ASU, and for his sins, the Chief of Staff to Michael Crow. So, Jim O'Brien.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm here today really on behalf of President Crow to welcome you and thank you for being here. What I'd like to highlight or kind of reiterate from Anne-Marie's comments are that this partnership between ASU and New America pairs the most innovative university and the largest public university in the United States with one of the leading think tanks in America. This is an experiment of a sort, and that is, can you take a university and can you blend it with a think tank in ways that we'll see today with this meeting, this conference, and in the Center on the Future of War. And I think now in year 4, I think the answer is yes, and I think we can see the really very positive outcomes of that kind of experiment. One other thing I just wanted to focus on for a moment was the kind of the spirit of what we're doing here. And I think, as many of you know, Sir Lawrence Friedman recently brought forth his new book, The Future of War, appropriately titled for this conference. And in there, he opens the book with the story in 1871, a fictional account is published of the German invasion of England and the successful German defeat of the English in 1871. But this fictional account took England by storm, and it set in motion really a whole series of imaginings and discussions about war and the future of war. In that book, the main character thinks about the loss of the English to the Germans in this fictional account and says, "We had plenty of warnings if we had only made use of them. The danger did not come on us unaware, it burst upon us suddenly. 'Tis true, but its coming was foreshadowed plainly enough to open our eyes if we had not been willfully blind." And it's this concept of being willfully blind that I think is sort of interesting today as we think about the future of war. And what I might add is, at the university, we're always trying to address this concept of being willfully blind. How do we not be willfully blind? How do we avoid that? What can we do? And so at ASU, we've taken a number of steps to do that at the university, and that is, we form partnerships, like the partnership with New America. How do we reach out beyond the university to others, as opposed to being trapped in our own mindset, in our own culture? So we work closely with New America, we work with the Mayo Clinic, we work with Starbucks. And so we try to find partnerships to help us avoid this problem of being willfully blind. The other thing that we do at the university, which I think will be present in the conference today, is we try to work on a transdisciplinary basis. How is it that as we create knowledge and transmit knowledge, we do that in a way where we bring people together, we blend ideas together, we don't allow knowledge to be trapped in various silos. And so this blending of knowledge, this transdisciplinary basis, is at the core of what ASU is up to, and what I think this event today is about. And finally, this notion of the envisioning of the future. And so we make a special effort, like the book published in 1871, using fiction as a means of envisioning the future. We have, for example, a center on the science and imagination at ASU, and we use that as a means of envisioning the future using fiction and completely different techniques. So, more than anything today, ASU's participation in this conference is about how is it that we take those kind of techniques, we think about conflict and war, and we do everything possible to avoid it, but to also understand it. So appreciate you being here today. This is a wonderful opportunity for the university to be in DC and to be part of an event like this. And with that, I'd like to welcome Peter Bergen and General McConville to the stage.
Welcome, everyone. It's my real privilege and honor to introduce General McConville, who is the 47th Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army. He is a graduate of West Point. He also did an MA in Aerospace Engineering at Georgia Tech. He was a security fellow at Harvard in 2002. He served a couple of tours in Afghanistan, also in Iraq. Previous jobs in the Army have included being Director of Personnel. He also commanded the 101st and at Fort Campbell. So he's had a great deal of experience in the military, and he's agreed to have a conversation for about half an hour, and then we'll open up to your questions. When you ask questions, hopefully you will identify yourself and wait for the microphone, and also General McConville can't address policy directly, obviously. So just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that. So General McConville, a personal question, which is you have 3 children who are serving, and that, what are the, does that make, are there problems about having a military that is increasingly becoming kind of a hereditary occupation? And are there strengths in that? What are the pros and cons?
Well, I think the strengths is we have a lot of senior officers who have children that serve in the military. So when we make decisions, that's certainly in the back of our minds. And we know that parents sent their most important assets to the Army and the military. And I think we always keep that back in our mind. This is someone's son or daughter that we're sending into combat. This is someone's son or daughter that we're sending off to do this mission. And we need to make sure we do that. Having said that, 79% of the people that come in the Army have a family member that served in the military. And we want to open that up. We don't want to become isolated. You know, we have gated communities right now because of security. And I think it's very, very important that we represent the total diversity of the United States and America, and we aim to do that.
How do you keep the military, I mean, the experience of being in the military is not common anymore in a way that it was not true 50 years ago. How do you ensure that your leaders are exposed to the civilian world and learning about the civilian world and are comfortable with working in that world, because at a certain point they're going to have to deal with that world?
I think I had the opportunity to, we send many of our officers to graduate schools, civilian graduate schools. We like to do that so they get a chance to go to school with civilians, and I had a chance to go to Georgia Tech, which was a great opportunity technical-wise, and I had a chance to go to Harvard. And so we try to send our officers with the most potential to those type programs so they have a chance to interact with the civilian counterparts as we go forward. We also do a lot of things about education, inviting leaders to our posts, influencers to our posts, teachers to our posts, so they get an idea of why someone may want to serve in the military. It really is a great opportunity, and unless you have an opportunity to meet some of the people that serve, you'll never really get that opportunity to understand.
I mean, there was a time when going off to graduate school as an Army officer might even have been a penalty on your career. Is that not the case anymore?
Well, I look at the Chief of Staff of the Army. He went off to Columbia for graduate school. I went to graduate school. So there's always certainly some tension between how much field time you get and how much education, and we're trying to find that right balance as we go forward.
So General Milley, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and yourself have sort of set up this new Futures Command.
Right.
What is the purpose of that, and why was it necessary?
Sure. You know, the old cliche is that generals are always trying to fight the last war, and quite frankly, we're not. We're trying to win the next one, and we're looking around in the world, and we find ourselves at an inflection point. For the last 16 years, we've been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, primarily doing counterinsurgency, counterterrorism type operations, and we just had a new national defense strategy come out and talk about great power competition, and not necessarily that we're going to go to war with great power competition, but we as a military, we need to be ready. And so we need to change the way we do business. The civilian industry, as far as when it comes to technology, has moved very, very quickly, so we need to adapt our industrial age processes so we can quickly modernize the military as we go forward.
It's a matter of public record that some of the defense systems that you need to modernize are communications networks that work amid heavy jamming, better defenses against drones, next generation combat vehicles, including unmanned. I mean, can you say something about those systems?
Sure, and you know, as we look into the future, our priorities that we've laid out are very relevant. Long-range precision fires. We want to be able to outrange and outgun any of our future adversaries as we go forward. We've got the world's greatest tanks right now, but as we look into the future, we're going to need a next-generation combat vehicle that may be robotic, it may be autonomous. Same thing as we look to our future vertical lift. We want a mesh network that's going to allow us to communicate in a contested environment. Air and missile defense, we're very concerned about unmanned aerial systems. And then for us, the lethality of the soldier is also very important.
You mentioned autonomous. I mean, how autonomous might these systems be? Because, of course, there's a kind of a discussion about keeping humans in the loop.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a person in the loop.
Yeah.
There just may not be a person in the lead aircraft or lead vehicle as we go into harm's way. But I think the nature of war is such that it's always going to be a battle of human wills, at least in the near future as we look forward. But we look to areas like with artificial intelligence, machine learning, as a situation that can help our soldiers in the battlefield, and our adversaries are looking in those areas, and we tend to look in the same area.
The Chinese did a demonstration of, like more than 100 drones with all sort of operated with AI that seems pretty autonomous relatively recently. I mean, even if we keep somebody in the loop or want to keep somebody in the loop, it seems like our adversaries are moving past that. I mean, what's your sort of thinking on that?
Well, we're certainly going to be able to counter their advantages. We're very aware about what some of our adversaries may be doing in the science and technology area, and that's why we're moving out very quickly. That's why we're establishing the Future Command, so we are much more agile, and we are much quicker in getting after these technologies.
You used to work at SOCOM, and the Futures Command is sort of based on the SOCOM acquisition system. Give us a little bit more detail about how that's going to work.
Yeah, it's really about developing very quickly. As we look around, it's almost what we call develop and then operationalize. Buy, try before we buy. Get out with the industry, and rather the way we operate right now is we'll spend 3 to 5 years trying to get the requirements for a future system exactly right. And by the time we get the requirements right and turn over to our acquisition corps, maybe 5 to 7 years before we actually field the equipment. So now we're at 12, 15 years, and we're trying to field the iPhone 1, and meanwhile industry has gone out and we've got the iPhone 10. So we know we have to be much quicker and as we go forward, and that's what we're trying to do. The other thing we've learned is for innovation, and we're looking for discipline innovation, is to bring industry in all walks of industry, not just the defense companies, say, hey, we got a problem. How can you help us solve the problem? Let them come back with ideas and prototypes, and we'll get it out to soldiers, and we'll try it, and then we'll quickly downsize and down select and get that moving into a program of record.
Another innovation is the Security Force Assistant Brigades. What are those and why are they necessary?
Yeah, we've been advising and assisting for the last 16 years, but we never had a force to do that. And as we go into the future, we look at that. We basically want to give our allies the opportunities to secure themselves. And in Afghanistan, we recognized that we were taking brigades of infantry and basically breaking them up so we could provide advisors to go forward, and we did that when I was Commander 101st. So what we decided to do was actually we would develop a force, make that force focused on being advisors, and then send them forward. We have our first Security Force Assistance Brigade in Afghanistan right now.
And you served 2 tours in Afghanistan. What are your big takeaways? I mean, we were there, 17 years later. You were there in 08, 09, and then 13, 14. What were the differences that you saw?
Yeah, I would say when I was there in 2008, 2009, that we were doing most of the fighting. The Afghan security forces were just brand new, developing. When our successes came back, they were partnered with the Afghan security forces. They were much better. When I came back a few years later, the Afghan security forces were in a position to actually take the lead for security. And today they are taking the primary lead. They certainly are taking more casualties than they did before, but they are responsible for the security of Afghanistan. What we're trying to do is give them the assistance they need so they can continue to progress with their forces, so they take less casualties and we can get to some type of political solution.
You also served in Iraq in a kind of urban environment. 90% of the world, up to 90% of the world will live in cities by the middle of the century. What implications does that have for what you do, for what the Army does, and the future Army?
Well, I think we fought some pretty heavy battles in Baghdad, Sarda City, in Fallujah, in Najaf, and what we learned is we're not going to bypass cities because that's where the people are. We're going to have to be able to operate in dense urban terrain, and it brings a lot of challenges that we need to develop equipment to. We need to develop tactics and concepts. We can do that, and that's part of the things that we're doing right now.
You're also a master aviator. And obviously in Mosul, it was a very dense urban environment. And ISIS was dug in amongst civilians. I mean, what are the lessons learned from a situation like Mosul?
Well, all cities are very difficult fights because we go in with a mindset that we're going to do all we can to protect the civilian population there. And some of our adversaries don't. They actually use civilians as shields. They put them in harm's way. And I've seen many a soldier in combat that put themselves in harm's way because they did not want to go after an enemy that was hiding behind civilians as we go forward. So we got to work out the tactics, techniques, and procedures to do that, and we're doing that as we speak.
And what does that look like in terms of training for that? I mean, how do you train for that?
Yeah, I mean, what we've built is we have urban training urban training sites at all our combat training centers. They're not of it's hard to build a 15 million person city to do that. But we are training on the techniques. We have the capability to go underground and work those situations. But the other thing we're working forward to or we're working on right now is with virtual reality. We can do a lot of things. It's amazing when you see, and this is how get a little out of the box. You start dealing with civilian industry who's doing a whole bunch of stuff in the gaming industry. And we are going after that virtual reality. You basically can get inside a gaming type situation that's very realistic, so we can train our soldiers as they were actually in that city or in that place as we go forward without building that entire city, without transporting our soldiers there. So we see that environment is something that we're going to get after in the future.
My guess is the successor organization to ISIS will also use these tools, perhaps, for their training, right, virtually? I mean, other adversaries will also use this.
Absolutely. And that's why we need to be quick. I mean, this gets back to Futures Command. We have to turn very, very quickly because our adversaries are doing the same.
You said that for the past half century, the Army was only contested on land, and now the Army will be contested in every domain. What did you mean, and what does that mean for the military of the future?
Yeah, I was just doing a little history, and we got a great Air Force. And the last time an American soldier was killed by an enemy aircraft was April 15th, 1953. So we really haven't been contested in the air. The last time a Navy ship was sunk by an enemy was 1945. And so as we look at the world, we've been able to pretty much move our troops into countries we need to go, move our equipment into the countries by sea. We've certainly been contested on the land and somewhat in the air, but we look as we go in the future, we'll be contested in all domains. So we're certainly going to be contested on the land. We're bringing back air defense units because we think we'll be contested by enemy air or by drones or some type of aerial systems. And we're very concerned about cyber, and we're very concerned about space because how dependent we've become on those domains.
And I mean, speaking of dependency, when information technology is ubiquitous in the force and somehow an adversary is able to interfere with that, I mean, how do you train people to not be overly dependent on GPS and other technology?
Well, I joke I try to tell some of the younger officers and NCOs, we used to have these paper things called maps, and we had things called compasses, and that's how we got to navigate. And now everyone has a phone. I mean, if you think about the agility that we get from GPS and move map displays, no one has a map in their car anymore. If you go somewhere, you just type it in, you quickly get there, and that in combat it works the same way. The ability at night to maneuver forces to a target is just unbelievable. So what we have to do and what we're doing is building resilient systems that are going to allow us to operate in that environment. We're also training our pilots and our ground crews that when they don't have
those systems, how do you operate? And we're building tactics, techniques, and procedures to do that also. Women are increasingly moving into combat units. What's the scale of that? What does the future look like? How is this happening?
Yeah, I'm really proud. I have a daughter that serves in the military, and I'm just really proud of what women are doing for the country. I want to put it in perspective. We have 170,000 women serving in the Army. 170,000. If you know that's almost the size of the Marine Corps, and make an incredible contribution. In 70,000 in the active Army. We have women, 10 women that graduated from Ranger School, which is our toughest school, and very, very impressive. We have ranges, and we have women commanding company in the 82nd Airborne Division Infantry Company. We have women in every single infantry, armor, artillery battalion, and every single brigade combat team in the Army right now as we speak. So it's very, very impressive. We have over 600 women that are in the infantry and the armor as we go forward. And I think, where does this end up? I think when we stop keeping track of the percentages, then we'll probably hit the right point. And I think we're getting towards that thing.
You have 180,000 Army personnel deployed around the world. I mean, that's a large number when only 15,000 roughly are serving in the war in Afghanistan. What is everybody else doing, and what does that mean about the future of the Army?
They're just not hanging around. No, they're pretty busy. Yeah. I mean, when you think about what an Army does, it really deters other folks' behavior. And so, when I first came in the Army, we had 250,000 soldiers in Europe to deter Russian aggression, or so, at the time, Soviet Union aggression. So we still have soldiers in Europe, and in a fairly good amount of soldiers deterring that type of aggression that may happen, and our partners want us there. We have soldiers in Korea that are deterring that type of aggression, and they certainly want us there. We have soldiers all over the Middle East, and most of what our soldiers are doing is just reassuring our allies and partners that will be there with them and deterring situations before they get out of control.
You mentioned Korea. I mean, obviously, without getting into the policy question, what is if it did come to war? What would that look like? Do you think?
Well, a lot of people just describe just how horrific that situation would be. If you've been to Korea, Seoul's 15, 20 million people, not that far from the border. A lot of artillery that could be used in those type of things. But I think that our adversaries need to understand that we have a very strong military that will do what it needs to do in those situations, and our military is ready to do what it needs to do, and hopefully a ready military will get folks to the table, and they can let the diplomacy take its path.
A number of American adversaries, ISIS, Hezbollah, Russian proxies in Ukraine, use sort of hybrid warfare, some combination of conventional terrorism, information operations. I mean, how do you fight an enemy that's doing that? How do you prepare for that in the future?
Yeah, the way we prepare is we've got to be strong everywhere. So we're certainly watching what our potential adversaries are doing. We kind of look at, best of breed, what type of capability do they have in each of these areas, and we want to get that type of overmatch as we go forward. So if they're using some type of drones, we want to make sure we can counter those drones, but not only we can counter them, we can counter them at a cost that's going to cause them not to want to go down that road. If they're coming after us with cyber, we want to make sure we have the ability to impose a cost on them if they choose to come after us in that area.
How do we, I mean, it seems that if you look historically, you're a graduate of West Point, I think 81, class of 81.
Yes, yes.
So, the Army, the military in general tends to want to fight the war that it's going to win. So, Saddam Hussein was perfect because it was in the desert and he had tanks and, the battle lasted. But, history keeps presenting things that don't, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. So how do you A, keep the lessons learned, and B, not fall into this kind of default mode of, well, we'll just, there'll be tank battles in some green field in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, a lot of times we talk about the future, we're talking about technology and the type of systems we need and the material solutions. And to us, I think it's a lot more important to focus on the people. And I would say and argue that in the Army, people are our most important asset. We're doing a lot in talent management. And a lot, if you study, if you study the Germans before World War II, people talk about blitzkrieg and the fact that they had radios and they had tanks, but it was really the leaders they had that they developed that were able to take that technology and apply it in a way that initially made them very successful. And so as we go in the future, we need leaders that can operate in different type environments, and we have to develop those leaders and then we enable them with technology so they can be successful in the battlefield.
I mean, for instance, the Security Force Assistant Brigade, it sounds, I know it's different from Green Berets, Special Forces, but I mean, it sounds like, is the Army sort of moving more into this sort of like Special Forceization model?
Well, first of all, they wear brown berets.
Okay,
We had
yeah.
so anyone, asked that question. They are not wearing green berets, and it's really share of the task in the battlefield. We have great special forces. They have done incredible things. If you go to Afghanistan, you just take a look at the commando forces that our special forces in our coalition partners developed. They are doing extremely well. But I would argue that what conventional forces in an advise and assist capacity bring is they bring the capability to develop an institutional army, which you need if you're going to be responsible and run a country. I mean, the Afghans know how to fight. We don't need to teach them how to fight. They've been doing it a long time, and they know how to do it very, very well. What they haven't done and over the years is develop a professional army that is going to be institutionalized, and that's what our advise and assist brigades are helping them do, is develop a professional conventional army that knows how to do logistics, that knows how to do artillery, that knows how to do medical evacuation in the battlefield, all those skill sets they need that are just not the fighting part.
Is there a danger of sort of imposing the American way of war on them? I mean, how do you kind of adjust for local circumstances?
Well, we have to be very, very careful about as we go forward, and that's why we do a lot of cultural training with the forces as they go forward. And the other thing is just the notion of how we advise and assist. As Americans, we tend to want to take the lead, and for some of our soldiers, we have to train them that you are really over the shoulder, in a position to help, but let our coalition partners figure out the right way to do it.
So the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service and the Iraqi Army writ large, I mean, obviously that went pretty well. What are the lessons learned from that and for the future?
I think what I've learned in our advising and having watched the 82nd do it, in fact, one of the brigade commanders, one of my battalion commanders, Pat Work, who they did a very, very good job of capitalizing on the strengths of the force that they were advising. They didn't do it for them. There's a tendency to want to do things for the force that you're advising. What you really want to do is take a step back and, use a cliche. You don't want to be a helicopter parent, like, raising kids. You want to give them an opportunity to do it the way they want to do it. And if they need help, you help them when they need it, but you give them the chance to do it themselves. You give them the enablers that allow them to win in the battlefield, and I think that's the best way ahead.
Thank you, sir. We'll open it up to questions. If you have a question, wait for the mic and identify yourself. Thank you. Stunned into...
Wow, great.
Testing?
Thank you.
Crystal from the BBC. Can you hear me now? You talked about the credibility of deterring North Korea. I would assume one of the questions of credibility would be, can you hear it? How about now?
I think we can.
Apologies. Once again, Chris Wolf from the BBC. You talked about the importance of the credibility of the deterrent for North Korea. I would ask, one of the questions about credibility would be stabilization in a post-conflict world. Does the US have the manpower? Can it get the allies to provide the manpower to credibly stabilize North Korea in a post-conflict world?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think anytime you go to war, you need to be ready for what happens afterwards. And from where we sit, what we want to do is the best way to deter a war is be prepared for war, and we are prepared to do those type things. And the other thing is you got to take a look at South Korea is a very modern country with a lot of capability, and it's their country as we go forward, and we'll certainly be prepared to assist them.
The military has a lot of experience now in Phase 4 operations, right? Arguably more than a decade and a half. I mean, what are the big lessons of those operations?
Yeah, as I think one of the critical things that has to happen after any type of conflict is to establish security first. You have to get security, and really you have to establish security by the local, local people have to be responsible for their security. And the quicker we do that, and if we don't have an idea of how that's going to be established or how that's going to happen, then we need to think our way through that. But that's, to get everything else going, if you don't have security, you're going to have problems all the way through. So somehow you got to establish a security force, you got to have some type of army to protect the country, you got to have a police force, you got to get those things going. Then you actually need a bureaucracy. We always, kind of joke about, bureaucracies, but you need one. And some of these countries don't have good government bureaucracies, and you need to get one going so you can actually start doing the things that people want you to do. Because, all people are the same. They want their kids to go to school, they want to have good jobs, and they want to have an opportunity for prosperity. And what we have to do is set the conditions for that to happen.
Does it, at an Army War College now, are you being taught that you might have to be effectively the district governor?
Well, we do. Again, we want to hand that over as soon as possible. But part of talent management is how we use the forces we have. And if you take a look at our reserve and guard forces, we have tremendous talent inside those organizations. And what we want to do is make sure we can get after it. So we're actually changing our personnel system to a talent management system. And I'll give you an example. When we were in Afghanistan in 2008, 2009, we're trying to develop the economy and we're trying to do all those type of things. And so we asked our Guard and Reserve forces what they actually did in real life. They're all soldiers, but what do you do? Well, we found out we had the head of the Texas Highway Department, so that person certainly could help us build roads. A lot of Afghanistan is agriculture, and I'm a kid from Boston. I've seen pictures of farms, so I have no idea, how that actually works. But we had people from states that were professional farmers, and so we could help them. But the assist, the help, what we don't want to do is do it for people. If you study any histories of insurgency, those type of things, if we end up doing it for the people of the country, we're never going to they'll let us do it. If I'm willing to mow your lawn every weekend, you'll let me do it, right? So, not that these people have lawns, but if they did, we go on that way. So that's what I think the future is how we get them back in charge, give them the security, and let them move forward as we go, as soon as we can.
Jen Easterly.
Jen Easterly, thanks for your remarks, General, and for your service. You talked a lot about people and talent management, but then to your point about 79% are folks that have relatives that are in the Army. I guess two questions. First, what are you doing about the recruiting piece to sort of widen that tent specifically? Yeah. And then secondly, you also talked about the importance of forging relationships with industry and with the private sector. So what are you thinking about in terms of opportunities and personnel policies that allow people to go back and forth more easily than we have now? Because working in the cyber business, I think it would be fantastic if we were able to enable people doing cyber in the Army to come into a critical infrastructure type entity and then go back again.
No, that's a great question, and that's really precisely what we're trying to do. We're actually putting in a system. It's an integrated personnel and pay system. But right now we have an industrial-based type system. So we manage people by really two variables. You're a captain of infantry or you're a sergeant of engineers, and we have three different personnel systems for our National Guard, for our Reserve, and for our active. So it doesn't really allow you to go back and forth the way we want to do. So we recognize that, and as we go in the future, we want a system that is going to manage each person's individual talent. So rather than you being defined by maybe two variables, we're going to define you by 25 variables. And we're going to credential you in a way that you're a person of cyber that has this skill level. We can bring you into the Army. We can allow you to serve. We can promote you based on that skill level and not necessarily how many combat tours you have or how many live fire events you did, because we recognize the future, we're going to need different types of people in the Army. And the thing on coming after civilian, what we're really trying to do is we need to expose the Army more to people. There's a reason why kids of military officers and NCOs go in the Army, because they know it. But I grew up in Boston. There was very little military around. If we have few kids in the neighborhood going to service, mainly because their dads were enlisted during the Korean War or during World War II. And if you don't have that anymore, then how will people, know what's going on as we go forward? So we've got to do that. The other thing on recruiting is only 29% of American youth are qualified to come in the military. And
Because
so
they're too overweight?
it's for a whole bunch. It's a whole bunch of reasons. But you think about that. To enlist in the United States Army today, only 29% of youth are qualified, and we're competing for those, extraordinary young men and women like everyone else is. And so we're trying to open up the aperture. We don't want to be just a family business or a military business. We want to give everyone the opportunity to serve because, someday, somewhere someone's going to ask them what they did, after a country was attacked. And, you look at veterans. Take a look at veterans, where they go when they're older. They come back and very, very proud of their service. So we want to give everyone an opportunity to be proud of their service.
Just to follow up on Jen's question, so this cyber expert who's promoted on his or her expertise in cyber, I mean, could he or she then take 2 years at Morgan Stanley to work with Jen, and that would not be penalized, a matter that would penalize their career and then come back?
Yeah, we do have some programs that do that. We send, but we need to do a better job. So we do, what we have is internships with training with industry. So we can send you over to train with industry. We can bring you back. We do have National Guard and reservists who are, work traditional on weekends. They're in, but what we need is a better system to allow us to bring the whole team together and do it in more of a seamless way as we go forward. So, and that's what we intend to do over the next couple of years.
This gentleman here, third row.
General Chris Miller from the Air Force Academy. Do you see a common vision among the services, and do you see a willingness in the Congress to modify law and policy to do the kinds of things you just described?
Well, I think we're seeing a common vision. We talk about multi-domain operations and multi-domain battles. So each of the services are looking from their perspective, and they see a lot of mutual interest in moving forward in this thing. So I think that is happening. There is concerns about how fast we go because there's a lot of interest when you change the acquisition system, and I would say we've disrupted it right now in the Army. And there's certainly a lot of concerns about how we're going to do this. But I think we've got to show success. We've got to show that we're being good stewards of the money that we're getting from Congress. And I think once we show that and prove that and put the right controls in place, we're going to have a better opportunity to move forward on this. Yeah. Yeah, it does. I think, what I was working very closely with the Congress. I mean, they want to do the same thing we want to do. They want to field the best force. And there's always, if they're going to put legislation in place, what they want us to do is take a look at the legislation we have right now. And, we are an up or out military. There's a reason why we do that. Some people complain about that, but, it goes back to before World War II when we were not. And the big joke was that there was so much dead wood around the War Department, it was a fire hazard. So we changed the system. Now the fact it's up or out, what we want to do is get people to perform and stay too, with the right skill sets and the right talents. And it's the nuance of how we do that as we go forward. Because I argue, we've got industrial age processes, both for talent management. It's really personnel management. It's industrial age, and I think we got industrial age processes for acquisition. I think we need to change both. That's what we're trying to do.
Joel Garrow from ASU.
Joel Garrow, Weaponized Narrative Initiative, Arizona State. You mentioned operating in the cyber domain, and you talked about imposing a cost against anybody. How would you envision doing that?
Well, I got a whole bunch of ways I can envision. Well, you talk about, I'm not going to get into actually methods, but here's the deal. If someone does something to us, they should, they should be deterred by what may happen back to them. And if they think they can do anything they want and never pay a cost, they will continue to do those type things. And we will see some of the most horrific things that happen as we go forward. We'll see people using chemical weapons. We'll see a lot of people doing things that, quite frankly, are immoral, unethical, and illegal. And I don't think we should let them do it.
Agreed, but isn't that exactly what's happening? And they can do just about anything they want, and we could never do anything back?
Well, again, I'm not going to get into policy things. My job is really to provide best military advice, and that's what we intend to do as we go forward. But it is developing capabilities. And there's a lot of competition, if you want to call it, below the level of war going on. And we need to be highly competitive in these areas. And so some of the technology we're looking at and some of the capabilities we have is certainly very competitive with our adversaries. And what we want to do is continue the overmatch so we get to the level of deterrence that we need to have.
My understanding is West Point started sort of as an engineering school to a large degree.
It did, yeah.
So should it be conceptualized as sort of a cyber warfare, cyber information? I mean, maybe that's already happening, but...
Well, it is. I mean, it's interesting to watch even how we send people to school. When I was going to graduate school, you had to go into hard science. So I went into aerospace engineering. I really wanted an MBA, but they said that's not going to happen. Even being an economics undergrad, they said you're still going to aerospace engineering. And that was exciting at Georgia Tech. But what we want to do, and then we started sending people for, some of the softest type sciences. What we're seeing right now is young men and women are very interested in going cyber. So our branches are competitive. So some branches are very, very competitive. And our top students coming out of West Point in engineering are going to cyber. Our top students coming out of ROTC are going to cyber. And we're doing something. We have some authorities within cyber where you can come directly into the military, just like our medical and legal folks. And we're working that as we go forward. We're the Secretary of the Army, and we have stood up a talent management task force. And the person that's actually going to run it is J.P. McGee, and he's coming from cyber. He's an operator, but he's coming out of cyber command. And that's why we're having that type of person. So we can be a little more innovative as we bring this. People like cyber into the force.
Any other questions? This gentleman here.
Tim Swijs, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little on your vision for the future of the Army in, let's say, 2025 in terms of the integration of unmanned. We know of some countries that have announced their ambition to have, by 2025, 30% of their unmanned forces, of their force to be unmanned platforms. This very week in the Netherlands, where I come from, I shook the hand of the first commander of the first RAS unit, Robotics and Unmanned Systems. His unit only consisted of two, him and one robot. Yeah. But I mean, it gives him... Yeah. So I was wondering about your vision for it.
No, I think, we first started experimenting with man-unmanned teaming in Iraq. And when you're flying over cities, at least... you personally learn that it's much better to have an unmanned aerial system up there getting shot at than having a manned system. So we've done a lot of work on unmanned systems on the aerial side. We have some type of robotics on the ground side, but I think as you look in the future, at least our vision is we're not going to put manned vehicles or manned aircraft into situations at the tip of the spear where the enemy threat is the largest. So, we are looking very much at that. If you think about the spectrum, you got manned, you kind of have semi-autonomous or remote, and then you have autonomous, basically, completely unmanned where the system kind of flies itself. We used to all be over here, and we're slowly moving to where we have, remote systems that, especially on the aerial side, they are pretty much not flown. They're almost computer aided. When we first started flying unmanned aerial systems, there was a pilot on the ground, just basically flying it just like you would an aircraft. Well, with the IT capability we have right now, it's more like operating a computer as we go forward. And once we get into more of the machine learning and artificial intelligence, then we're going to have the capability to do a lot different type things. But you're going to see a lot more of the unmanned, even unmanned teaming as we go forward, both on the air and the ground. And that's where our technology is going. But I still believe there'll always be a person in the loop. They just may not be in the lead aircraft or the lead vehicle.
George Nicholson.
Sir, George Nicholson with the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. Years and years ago, and I'm dating myself, General Gorman, when he was a Southcom commander, said we've got a great propensity of hanging the millstone of technology around our partners' necks, things they can't afford to buy, they can't afford to maintain, they can't afford to operate. I remember talking to the J3 in Honduras. He said, I don't need 47 Echoes. I don't need terrain following, terrain avoidance radar. I've got pilots who've got 20,000 flying hours. They know this area like the back of their hands. What are you looking at in terms of working with our partners out there, getting them something that they can afford to maintain, operate, and
No, that's a great point. I learned that as a young officer in Central and South America, where, just like you said, we'd come in, and I mean, there's a tendency to say, hey, we need to give folks the best equipment. What you want to do is give them the equipment that they can actually use and they can maintain, and they can train on and they can afford. And quite frankly, we're doing the same thing at our level. We want to make sure that the equipment we buy is not exquisite. It's something that we can afford as we go down in the future, because there is a tendency. You talked about where we got one person, one robot. If you buy an exquisite system, you may only have one robot. And mass matters on the Army, and so as we look into the future, we can't rely on technology because someone's going to take it away from you. So simple systems that are inexpensive is kind of our approach as we go forward.
This gentleman here.
Thank you, General. First, I would like to thank you and congratulate you for the great job you are doing, the United States is doing in leading and operating the coalition in Iraq. My question is that while the operation Inherent Resolve reaches its final stages, at least the major operations, and moving to a stabilizing stage, what should we do to avoid repeating the previous scenarios where the U.S. did a great job and eliminated Al-Qaeda, and then we had another terror group resurfaced, especially when it comes to the borders, and how can the U.S. help Iraq in securing its borders with Syria, for example, where Iraq had always the problem of terrorists and armed groups crossing the borders to the country. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think as everywhere else, we want Iraq to be able to secure its own borders and secure its own country, and I think that's the discussion that's going on right now, how this will be stabilized, what forces will stay, what will not. I'm sure that General Votel and will make a recommendation to the Joint Chiefs and Secretary Mattis, and they will come up with a plan that will actually figure out how we're going to do this.
Well, I want to thank General McConville for a very illuminating set of remarks very much. And thank you. You're a very busy man, and we're grateful that you came.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start our next panel right now. So if you'll take your seats, we've got a great one coming up. While the chairs are getting set, please welcome to the stage Jen Easterly, Peter Singer, Robert Lee, Lieutenant General retired Robert Schmidl, and Ian Wallace.
Do I need to introduce? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first panel of today. Looking forward to how the United States wins the cyber war of 2028. Before we get into the panel itself, we're going to have a survey round with 2 questions just to get your sense of how you're thinking of these questions. So if we could have the first question, please. I am assuming that a question will come up shortly. So you should have clickers And you can read the question and I can't. But the key thing there is, in the next decade, what cyber threat is the most dangerous to the United States national security? And credit where it's due, I should say that these questions are very heavily based on a triptych created by SAIS professor Thomas Reid about the threats that the US faces. And very shortly we will have the answer to that, I think. Okay, pretty conclusive, if that's true. Sabotage is what you're all most worried about. We actually then have a second, oh, it's changing. Sabotage, slightly ahead of subversion, with espionage and battlefield threats coming in relatively low down. We'll let that settle. We then have a second question for you. If I could ask you to cue that up. Subtly different question, this time asking you which of those threats is the United States least able to manage. And again, pretty conclusive there that subversion is the one that the US government is least capable of managing, and we're going to get very much into that question of subversion and disinformation as we go through this panel. So, as we get going, as Albert mentioned, we have a fantastic lineup. Just to recap, Rob Lee, who is a New America Cybersecurity Fellow, as well as being the founder CEO of Dragos Inc., industrial control systems cybersecurity company, and importantly, a former Air Force officer. Jen Eastley is Managing Director, Head of Cyber Fusion at Morgan Stanley, but also an ex-Army officer. We have Bob Schmidl, Professor of Practice at Arizona State University and an ex-Marine. Well, I think you're never an ex-Marine, I think he was a Marine. And Peter Singer, who is Strategist and Senior Fellow at New America, author, amongst other things, of Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next world war. So, the premise of this panel is very much that the information technology is going to fundamentally change the character of conflict, and I think that's sort of built into many of the panels, but also that the United States, maybe even most countries around the world, have not necessarily fully made the mental shift to respond to that. And this, I think, the premise of this panel is also that this is not necessarily just a military problem. In order to set the scene, however, I'm going to hand over to Peter, who's been writing and thinking about this for several years, just to give us an overview of the things that we might want to think about. Peter.
Sure, thank you. So I was thinking a way of framing this is to imagine if we were gathered 10 years ago, what would we have identified as the key trends that might affect cybersecurity, cyber war in 2018, and use that as a way to look at, okay, how would we look forward 10 years? So if we had been gathered 10 years back, there's a lot of issues we might have talked about, but I think we definitely would have talked about three. One would have been the question of intellectual property theft and our adversaries stealing our secrets, and how might that advantage them or not on the battlefield. That issue was just starting to percolate, be taken seriously. You had had major US weapons programs that had had serious breaches, et cetera. The second would have been some kind of question of surveillance and privacy, and what does that mean for this space? And the third, we would have likely had a debate back and forth about what kind of organization do we need in this space, and we all would have said something around, well, we need something like a cyber command, and this is what it should be, and this should be how it's structured. Now, the challenge is that all three of those issues, we didn't solve them over the last 10 years. Intellectual property theft, continues, and we've now seen the fruits of that campaign. So the latest U.S. and Chinese stealth fighter just coincidentally look the same. Surveillance privacy. What we would have argued about back in 2008, we wouldn't have mentioned Edward Snowden, and we would have had a very different kind of discussion. So that problem not solved either. Encryption debate still with us. The question of cyber command, it's here. We're having a different kind of organizational debate around it. Okay, none of those have gone away, but I would offer that if we're looking at the great cyber war of 2028, there's three more that have moved to the fore that makes it even more complicated. The first issue is the complete and utter collapse of cyber deterrence. The message that Russia and every other actor received in the wake of 2016 and the campaign of attacks on the United States and all our key allies is that this works. Related to that, we have the fact that Ukraine has been treated as a battle lab for learning all of the different things that you can accomplish in this realm. And I think Rob's going to hit that really importantly. But again, this hits in everything from information warfare attacks alike. And importantly, we've seen the crossing of key norms in targeting critical infrastructure. All sorts of things we said for the last 10 years you never ought to do, we've seen that crossed. Penetration into nuclear power plants and the like. And then finally, we have the international efforts to build cybersecurity and cyber war norms and rules of behavior and international institutions. Those have all fallen apart. So I think if we're looking for historic parallels, we might look at this period as akin to the Spanish Civil War, where you saw Spain in the 1930s treated as everything from a battle lab for testing new technologies, tactics, etc. But we also saw the message received that the international community was going to let adversaries get away with it, that their activities would be low cost, high gain. The second thing I would toss out there is the hybridization of pretty much everything. So we have criminal actors being used to conduct state operations. And the Russian campaigns would be a great illustration of that, both targeting Ukraine, targeting the United States, you name it. We have the inverse, which is state actors being used to conduct criminal activities. So Lazarus Group coming out of North Korea conducting one of the biggest bank robberies in history. We also have the hybridization of realms that in the United States we separated cybersecurity, information operations. Well, that's not how the rest of the world does it. They've brought them together, whether you're talking about Russia or China or the like, they're crashing together. So the targets, the tactics, basically all the activities are becoming hybrid. And then the third is that the internet itself is changing. We're moving to the Internet of Things. So we're not just using our smartphones to communicate, but we're looping together smart power grids, smart bases, driverless cars, you name it. That's wonderful. That creates efficiency. It also massively grows the attack surface. And we're recreating all the mistakes of cybersecurity on the other side of not baking in security. And so the final happy thought I'll leave you for the great cyber war of 2028 is that we will see kinetic attacks on the Internet of Things, which will break things and which will kill people. The IoT being targeted will fundamentally change the politics of cybersecurity because all the rest of us are going to be able to wrap our heads around what it means. It's not just going to be, oh, millions of files were taken. It's going to be something broke, someone died. And again, that will change the politics of it, whether you're talking about at the state, local, global level.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to ask the panel to unpack some of those thoughts based on their expertise. Then we're going to have a bit of a conversation about that, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So please be thinking about the questions that you would like to ask this panel. But the survey showed that people are definitely concerned about sabotage. Peter raised that. Rob, you spend your daily life worrying about the cybersecurity of the industrial Internet of Things. Over the next decade, what do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, so I would largely agree with what was said and note that if we look at the past 10 years as it relates to industrial infrastructure, so ICS and SCADA, those type of terms, When you look at what has happened, it's largely been an avoidance of the issue. So we've seen a lot of good discussions about it, but a lot of the insights into actually what's been going on in those environments have been in the private sector, in those industrial networks, away from where people are collecting and monitoring. Your large security companies who typically have great insight into the threats that we talk about and face and even reach into larger political discussions have always collected in enterprise business networks. That's where they have technologies and sensors and people to look and see what's going on. We haven't had that in industrial. 10 years ago, we could look at the campaigns and activity groups that were targeting the enterprise and getting reports like APT1, and there was no mention of industrial espionage, industrial control attacks, but they were occurring, and we can actually look back at some of that data set and see that it was there, but the expertise in the collection wasn't there. We see that now going forward as well, where it's still just starting to come up to the discussion. So taking the Ukraine discussion as well as sabotage, if we look from 2012 to 2014, just over a 2-year period, we saw a significant increase in targeting of U.S. infrastructure from our strategic adversaries. But it was all preparatory type work, just looking and identifying what they could find in our infrastructure. If we then look at 2015 to 2018, we have a number of concerning attacks. We had Ukraine 2015. I was fortunate enough to be one of the lead investigators on that, looked through that case, and saw an adversary dedicate 20 to 30 people and a lot of resources to trying to take power down across 3 regions of Ukraine. That was a lot of learning for them. It wasn't that they are this mythical great adversary. I think we kind of build up the adversary at times, but a lot of learning taking place. 2016, when they did it again, they codified it into software. So my firm identified what was called crash override. That was, in essence, whatever they learned in 2015 getting put into software to make it scalable in 2016. And then in 2017, we saw Trices, another thing that we got to be involved with from the defensive aspect. And that one hasn't gotten a lot of discussion, but I think it probably should, because it took place in Saudi Arabia, but it was the first piece of malware ever specifically designed to kill people. We are very fortunate people didn't die. So this 10 years from now prediction about people dying, fully support it, because I was concerned that we were going to lose life last year when that capability was deployed. So what do I see, and what do I see as a problem? The first of which is that when we do get these opportunities to have a more nuanced discussion in the public and maybe even set some norms, we largely abdicate our duty to it. 2015, first ever cyber attack against the power grid. What was done? Nothing. Not a single senior policy member, White House administration, anybody came out and even condemned that the attack took place. 2016, different administration, nothing. 2017, Trices, Saudi Arabia, nothing. We're setting a precedent that these attacks are actually a great investment because they don't come with the baggage that other types of conflict do. So when we give up our opportunity to influence the discussion on those key pivotal points, we will end up losing our ability to have these longer discussions in 2028. With the industrial Internet of Things and some of the technologies that are coming out, and then I'll pivot to my other panelist, I see an over-focus on sometimes technology and buzzwords other than actually focusing on what the mission is and what we're going to do with it. How many of you have had to listen to pitches on AI and blockchain? If I hear how blockchain is going to solve security one more time, I swear I'm just going to go become a farmer. Nobody actually needs a ledger. If you want a ledger, we can show you how to get a ledger without making blockchain a thing. But we have a sort of focus, an over-focus on silver bullets. We're just going to fix this. Blockchain is going to revolutionize AI. Oh my gosh, we have it for offensive and defensive purposes. I spent my career at the National Security Agency. If AI was that awesome, we would have already taken advantage of it for all sorts of things. It's just machine learning. It's powerful, it's useful, but it's not a panacea for these effects that we're looking towards. So I think we have to recognize the problems we have. Industrial is not going away. Industrial is actually the very fabric of the modern civilization we have. We have to treat it as such, and we have to treat it both as a policy, business, and technology focus, rather than thinking that, again, ignoring the problems or silver bullets are going to fix it.
Thank you. Jen, emerging consensus that what is going to distinguish sort of future war from previous wars is the US homeland is going to be targeted, and cyber is going to be the sort of vector for that. The critical infrastructure sector that has been perhaps most targeted to date is the financial sector. From where you are now, how do you see prospects for the next decade?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. and I'm going to try really hard not to talk about blockchain.
Okay, okay.
So I know we're looking out to the future war, and I thought it was a great setup from you and Peter. I thought it'd be more useful to talk a little bit about the near future and sort of how somebody who's part of the financial services sector and critical infrastructure looks at it now. And it'll pull some threads from what Peter laid out. But in terms of how we look at the threat right now, I think it's important just to kind of do a survey of the trends. If you think about just 2017, you think about ransomware, which was a big story over the last couple of years. Some of the attacks from WannaCry to NotPetya to Bad Rabbit, obviously having significant impacts on people not being able to get to their data. So one major thing. The second, which was alluded to, is data breaches, whether that was through publicly released vulnerabilities that were not patched in time. We saw massive amounts of personally identifiable information. Obviously, Equifax, Uber, all of this has significant impacts on financial services because ultimately degrades people's ability to authenticate into their network. So you see PII, which is widely available on the dark web, and that leads to things like credential validation attacks against certain systems that banks have for people to be able to log into. We also saw the distributed denial of service attacks, I think, that were alluded to, speaking directly to lack of availability. If people can't get onto their accounts, it directly impacts the sort of credibility and the reputation of the bank. So that has major impacts. And then what also Peter alluded to is this SWIFT, threat actors going after the global payment system has massive impacts on, again, the credibility and the integrity of being able to move money. And, as I think was alluded to, we saw the Lazarus Group or allegedly North Korean-sponsored actors responsible for the Bank of Bangladesh attack in 2016 going after about $1 billion. They only got 81 million, but then a series of other attacks against SWIFT. I think that is one of the more interesting stories and trends that we see are these sort of what one might refer to as a rogue nation-state actor using allegedly leaked very powerful nation-state tools to commit fraud or theft. And you could argue, the other piece of that, not just Bank of Bangladesh, but the WannaCry attack, which was attributed to the Lazarus Group as well, using tools like Eternal Blue or Eternal Romance to do, a ransomware attack. So trends that portend a very increasingly and accelerating and complex and dynamic threat landscape. And even, that was just sort of 2017. If you look at the first quarter of this year and you look at these massive DDoS attacks against Arbor and GitHub, you look at Meltdown and Spectre, which are vulnerabilities that affect every chip in computers. These have significant impacts on us right now with respect to the financial services sector. Your point, I think, is a good one, is the sector was hit pretty early on, and I think, at least from just having been at Morgan Stanley for a year, what I've seen is some really good efforts to get ahead of this increasingly, as I said, complex and dynamic threat environment by bringing together the key banks through the FSI stack, which has been around for a while now, or through the FSARC, the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resilience Center, which is some of the smaller banks that are very actively sharing information, which I think is great. But all of this, for me, at least in the near future, really necessitates making sure that we not only have the right organizational structures in place, and I think there's some lessons learned from my most recent experience in government and counterterrorism, but a real emphasis on technology, process, and probably first and foremost, people. I think we have to get the people thing right. And to the point of the last discussion with General McConville, the need to make sure that we are very deliberately managing talent, both in the private sector and in the public sector, and allowing for personnel policies that perhaps can facilitate the transfer back and forth between critical infrastructure and the military or the government to sort of raise all talent levels. So I'd love to talk more about that, but that's sort of the near future view of what I see.
And we definitely will talk more of that. Bob, since you retired from the military, I know you've been thinking about this issue in various ways, but just very specifically for the purposes of our opening remarks, I wondered if you might talk a little bit about the threats to the deployed force. That there is a natural desire to talk about homeland security threats, but Peter wrote a best-selling book sort of saying that cyber is actually a big issue for the military. Are we in danger of forgetting that in focusing on all of the threats to infrastructure in the financial sector?
Okay, so I think what we ought to do is to start with the way that we think about warfare, right? So when we even talk about the future of war, I would suggest that one of the things that we are not going to have the luxury of is having a clearly defined line between when we're at peace and when we're at war. And so just, from my experience doing this, the first night at Desert Storm when we all lined up on the runway at Sheikh Issa with our lights off, as soon as you plugged in the afterburners, you knew that everything had changed. It was going to change. The ROE was different. Things were different. We were at war and we were going to treat the way that we were behaving in a different manner. That's not going to happen, I don't believe. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that we are actually at war right now. And it is the war of ideas that has, so you can tell I come from New England, right? So we put R's on the end of the word. The thing is, you can kill people, and we do that, and we found some really efficient and effective ways to do that over the years. But what you can't kill are ideas. And so, the whole purpose of propaganda, for example, is to influence an outcome without resorting to physical violence. So if we think about the future, what I would suggest is that the war is not going to be declared. We already see the Russians talking about this, from Gerasimov and others, that have begun to say that in the future wars will not be declared. They will simply be an increase in the level of violence. So if we are at war now, our notion of what it means to be at war is something that I think we need to examine, and that we need to think about how we're going to fight this war of ideas. How are we going to be able to counter disinformation, to counter weaponized information? How is it that we are going to be able to do that? If the purpose of disinformation is, and I would suggest it actually is not the content of that disinformation that is most important, that the purpose of that is to create a social bond among people that will then believe what it is inside of that micro world that they're being told. And this is the understanding why people seem to believe things in spite of the fact that all the evidence points to a different answer. There's a famous American philosopher named Groucho Marx who once said in a movie called Duck Soup, if you ever get a chance to watch this, after some event occurs, Groucho takes the cigar out of his mouth and looks, and he says to this guy, and he said, "So who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" So just think about that, because what's happening now is that we are subjectively, and we have been for years, interpreting the things that happen out there. And we haven't accounted for the way that bots accelerate the disinformation that comes out, the way that people take in information, that so much more of it now is coming through things like Facebook that tailors that information in a way that begins to simply reinforces your worldview. So to the point that Peter made earlier, I fully agree that there are some really Gucci technical capabilities that cyber is going to give us today, has today, and into the future. The kinetic effects of cyber, again, I don't think that that's where we ought to be focused as we think about the future of warfare. We ought to be focused on the war of ideas and how it is that we are going to counter the narratives that are out there now, how we're going to deal with narratives that actually are having an effect on our view of the world, right? Our Enlightenment view of the world, that we think that if all rational people can sit down and observe the same facts, that we'll come to the same answers. We can't even agree on what the facts are. We have people talk about a or alternative facts, about a post-factual, a post-truth world. I don't think that that's necessarily all completely accurate, but there has been, with the advent of postmodernism, more and more people believe that truth comes from those that have the power to be able to say what is and what is not true. And so when we think about that, and we think about the fact that we just spent the last century trying to defeat two totalitarian governments, right? The Nazis and the Soviet Union, and the resurgent Russia that's out there today, we ought to be thinking about how those governments came to be, especially in countries that had such a deep history, in the case of Germany, of Enlightenment philosophy. So again, I think it's the war of ideas. I think we need to think about that. We need to think about narratives, and we need to think about the fact that in the history of the human race, we've not really been successful at killing ideas, not nearly as successful as we've been about killing each other. And I would suggest that the war it's happening now. We're not going to have a big bright day where you're going to get up and all of a sudden everything's going to be offline. That may happen, but that is the end result, I would argue, of a larger and more insidious change in the way that we think about, for instance, this great experiment of ours in constitutional democracy. So.
Peter, you spent the last 2 years thinking about many of these issues, writing a book that we will all get to read in October. But give us a sort of sense of where your research has told you about what we need to worry about out sort of now and over the next decade on the issue of sort of social media and disinformation in warfare.
Sure. So the project, Ian, if you're going to plug it, you got to plug the name of it. But it actually aligns really well with what the journal laid out. It's a book project called Like War that'll be out in October. And it's a play on the idea of we're seeing realms where war and politics are coming together. So we are winning elections using information warfare techniques. In turn, ISIS is winning battles by using the same digital marketing that Taylor Swift does. And so they're all crashing together. And I think if we're looking at the future of this space, I see again that parallel to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. We've spent the last couple of years experiencing what you can do with fake accounts, what you can do with the influence of sock puppets, whether that's humans posing as someone else or bots. We've seen the impact of fake news. And again, whether it's changing battlefield outcomes in Syria and Iraq, or it's potentially or arguably changing election outcomes. There's a really interesting study that just came out of Ohio State that looked at what exposure to fake news did to voter turnout in the 2016 election. And basically it depressed people who had previously voted for Obama, if they were exposed to fake news like Pope endorses Donald Trump, it brought it down, it took voter turnout for them by 2%, which if you crunch the numbers, actually was enough to swing things. But if we're looking to the future, what worries me is to go back to this idea of hybridization. So it's not something that's completely fake, it's the melding of what's fake and real. Which makes it more effective. And this is known, particularly when you look at the video side, as deepfakes. And like so much of the internet, this comes out of two places. It comes out of the porn industry and university labs. So if we've got a picture here, this is where someone melded the real face of Gal Gadot Versano, who's the star of Wonder Woman, onto the body of a porn star, making it seem as if she appeared in a movie that she definitively did not appear in. So if you can go to the next slide, you can also not just meld, but change. This is from a University of Washington experiment where they were able to synthesize a presidential speech that never happened. So you could make Barack Obama or anyone else, if you've got approximately 30 visual data points, which through social media you don't just get 30, you get literally thousands. You can make them essentially say what you want them to say. Next slide. So we're just now starting to get a taste of this in our politics. This is from an Instagram that the young survivors of the Parkland mass killing made where they're advocating for gun control. And if you can go to the next slide, very quickly it was changed to make it appear as if she did something that she didn't. So if you saw, she was tearing up a target, and quickly it was made to appear as if she is tearing up the Constitution. That was coordinated via social media, and then it was driven viral by a mix of alt-right and Russian bots and the like. So, sounds familiar. And my point in all of this is that we, US government, need to understand this is a weapon. This is a weapon that will be used against US democracy and the US military. It is a weapon that will be far more important and far more effective than many of the real weapons that concern us, as well as many of the fake ones like EMP that get a lot of attention. And so we need to start to do R&D on how to rapidly identify and debunk and defeat this kind of weapon that's going to hit us, that's been proven to be effective. And in turn, it can't just be on the US military, the US government to figure this out. It also is on the platform firms to figure out how do they prepare their networks for this weapon being used on them. Are they going to need to, a little bit parallel to the financial sector, come up with the equivalent of like credit card, the ability to mark transactions, hashes. Maybe this is actually where blockchain will be effective.
Digital hashing will do the whole thing for you without blockchain, but that's...
We'll hear on that.
Yeah.
But then it's also, the third part is it's on the media to figure out what are they going to do about this weaponization. Are they going to enable it or not? Which again was the exact same question they didn't ask themselves when, for example, foreign actors hacked people in the American political establishment, weaponized it to hit our democracy. They didn't go, hold it, am I going to help this battlefield action from another side? So this is, I think, going to kind of, I would have said it's 2028, but I think we're going to see it starting in, maybe as soon as, we saw the micro version here. What's it going to look like in the 2018 election? What's it going to look like in the 2020 election? How is it going to be used against US operations, be them in Syria or the like?
So my job in all of this is to keep the panelists on point. So returning to our question of what it takes to win cyber wars, and even that concept is a little bit debatable. What does this actually mean for the distinction between civilians and the military? The consistent message from what you said is that we're seeing a blurring of responsibilities. We have a new Cybercom commander, NSA director coming in. What should he make his job, and how should that be different from what you, Rob, you, Jen, Mark Zuckerberg should be worrying about?
Great way to clump us in with Mark, yeah. Still no blockchain would be great. But what does it actually look like for the military? So I think about this a lot. I get asked this a lot from my military peers. And I would say we have to figure out whose lane in the road goes to what problem. I see a lot of effort and resources continually wasted by very well-intentioned groups, each claiming ownership of the exact same problem, and then debating between themselves to fix it. I gave a Senate testimony recently on what we needed to do for infrastructure security, and one of my big positions is when it comes to the government, they need to stop, and this can get into a political discussion, but stop going out to executives at like power companies saying, we can do your incident response and your services and your defense for free when a cyber attack happens. Even if you legally could, which there are debates, you're not well resourced for it, nor do you have the skills to do it at scale. And so getting ready to give this testimony, it was interesting to me that I had DOE, DHS, DOD, and National Guard components each reach out to me to complain about each other, hoping that it would get into my Senate testimony about why they shouldn't do it and how they should. And my position is actually all of you should stop going out and advertising this capability. So when it comes to the role of these government agencies and private sector, there's a ton of very well-intentioned people with very good skills that each have a role to play, but there are certain things the private sector can do. There are certain things the private sector is better at. Knowing what's in their networks and training and defending their networks, they are better at. Going and making hard policy statements against the Russian state and being able to wage Title 10 or Title 50 kind of conflict and intelligence, they're not as good at, nor they should be good at it. There are purposeful roles of government, military, DHS, DOE, et cetera, and we need to make sure we play to the strengths. One of my concerns for 2028 is well-intentioned groups having a butterfly effect and killing those local economies. Good example of this goes back to the infrastructure debate. Right now, there are many National Guard units, not all of them, many of them are right on point where they should be, but many of them have gone out to conferences that I've gone to and said, we will do instant response. When the cybers happen, call me, and we'll come in and do instant response for you. And then you ask them their plan, their familiarity with that type of control equipment, how many times have you operated a high-energy transformer, any of these kind of discussions, and it falls apart. But then what happens is the power company owners don't go to the instant response firms that are actually building those skill sets, coming up with innovation and figuring how to do that. They think, nope, I've got this, call the CERT, call the DHS number, that's my instant response plan. So what it in effect does is it kills that expertise in the community that should be coming up against these threats and becoming quite literally battle hardened. I'll give one more that sounds like a complaint, but it's really just a warning. I have better intelligence today on industrial control system threats at my firm than I had at the NSA when I ran the mission. And it has nothing to do with people and capabilities. It has to do with being in those networks to collect that data and having well-skilled people outside of bureaucracy. The problem is, even when I publish a nice intelligence report to our customers and folks, it will take about 3 weeks for it to come back to me as a classified report with our logos removed from it, claiming that the government found it. That actually has introduced problems for me twice, where it actually almost led to FBI-type investigations, thinking that we stole classified data when we were actually the original source of it. This is an actual big issue. If you want to talk about building skill sets up, and having capabilities of people in your communities who can actually do security, my concern for 2028 is people not sticking to lanes where they actually focus on problems, and instead, when they run into challenges, pivoting, because they're really good people, pivoting to something easier that actually is a place where private sector can and should be in.
Civil roles?
Yeah, just to your point on Cybercom, I guess I'd say a couple things. You mentioned the new vision statement that's out there. And I'll say up front, I am personally very excited about Paul Nakasone, if and when he gets confirmed, taking over both NSA and Cybercom. I think there's nobody better for that job, nobody more experienced both on the signals intelligence side as well as the cyber side, and exactly the right person to take over that job and to grapple with the tough questions of how do we continue to build capacity and capability, and the elevation to the unified command, the question of whether they split the dual hats that was put together, almost 10 years ago when I worked with him on the Cybercom I-team. I think one of the things that they're going to need to spend a lot of time on within that vision statement, it talks about things like resiliency, which I think we can all agree with, but a more sort of active defense and a constant contesting of the adversary. And so really figuring out what that means and then operationalizing that, both from a military perspective, which I won't weigh in on because it's been a while, but in terms of their relationship with critical infrastructure, I think is something that we need to figure out, not 2028, but as we've all been sort of circling around, these are current threats, these are things we're going to need to deal with in the very near term, whether it has to do with information operations that not only can affect our democracy, but can also move markets in a pretty significant way. These are things we're going to need to figure out how to develop that pretty strong connective tissue between the government and various facets of the government, where the capability and capacity lie, but where the right legal authorities and the policy framework, I think still, again, having been away from it for a little bit, could use some focus, frankly, and then to figure out, again, how we develop this relationship with all the critical infrastructure sectors to make sure that if there are significant attacks, that we have a capability to work hand in hand to, ultimately defend the nation.
So
Go ahead, Bo.
Just to pile onto that for a minute. So if we agree that perhaps that the threat that we face in the future is a threat to the narrative, if you will, that we tell ourselves about this democracy and about how this country operates, about what's of value to us. How is it that you are then going to, if that's sort of the, quote, non-traditional way of looking at this, how do you focus an organization like the United States Cyber Command on that kind of a threat? In the case of a National Guard unit, how does a National Guard unit in State X respond to a request to ensure that their voting system is in fact secure? And when they discover that it's not just the sort of moat security, right? So we all know that that's not the good visualization. I mean, the big challenge is that there is no longer a home game and an away game, right? It's just the game, and it includes everything. So as we think about defending those kinds of things that are of value to us in our infrastructure, part of which is or I would suggest the heart of it is the information that's out there. How do we organize ourselves to be able to do that, given what Jen just said, which is absolutely the challenge today, given the authorities that are stovepiped in every way, shape, and form that you can imagine to align with the stovepiping of the organizations. The line between what the Department of Homeland Security would do in the event of an attack on the critical infrastructure and what Cybercom might do, in spite of the fact that we've been having this discussion for well nigh 10 years now, 8 years, we still don't have a clearly defined, at least in the minds of many of the folks that are going to be called upon, a distinction or a delineation between where that line would be, given that historically what we have seen in places for natural disasters, like think Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, whatever, that when bad things like that happen at scale, the U.S. military is generally called upon to come do something. No one knows quite what that is, and we ride to the sound of the guns and away we go. So how we think about that, even just being able to react to something like that. And then, but the more important question is, how do we think about proactively dealing with this? If you know the bots are in certain places and you know that they are bot farms that are owned by organizations that have an affiliation with government X, what is the authority? What ought the authorities be? What would the role of Cyber Command be in doing something about that? And how we make the distinction between whether we're going to turn those things, whether we're going to send them to Mars, whether we're going to do something else, it remains to be seen. But I think it's stepping back from what we've traditionally seen as the mission of the United States Cyber Command and thinking more broadly, strategically about how this threat that has become so evident here in the last few years with regard to what information has done to affect, if you will, some of the things that have been happening in the world. And the very last thing I would say is that any discussion about this has got to go back to the weakest link in this thing. So like cybersecurity, we realize that the weakest link in the cybersecurity chain is us. It's the operators, right? The weakest link in this chain of disinformation is also us. You know, we tend to forget that if any of you have a chance to Google this thing, Orson Welles played the War of the Worlds, right, from the Mercury Theater in the 1930s. And 3 different times during that 40 minutes, they came on, stopped, and said, this is only a drill. This is made up, it's fiction. And yet it caused widespread panic in New Jersey. Now, it could have been because it was in New Jersey, I don't know, but nonetheless. So.
Peter, the General said the sort of $64 million question. What's the answer? What should the strategy be?
The answer in so much of cybersecurity is WWED. What would Estonia do? And by that I mean whether it is the strategy of building a digital economy, but thinking about security as you build it, and a convenient digital economy, a lot more convenient than ours, to a strategy of resilience, understanding that you can't stop threats from hitting you. It's how do you become resilient to them? So kind of this overall strategic thinking, to creating organizations to fill gaps. So I'm in complete agreement with the idea that we need to make the transfer of knowledge between private sector and government or active duty military a lot easier. But there's also, at the end of the day, and I think Rob also touched on this, there's only so much capacity, only so much expertise that you can locate within government or the military. So we've built up National Guard capability, but at the end of the day, to serve in the military, to serve in the National Guard, you have to meet a set of physical requirements that the previous general mentioned not everyone meets. You have to meet a series of criminal background and what you can smoke or not. You have to join the National Guard, even as a cyber expert, you have to be willing to say, yeah, I'm a cyber expert, but if you need me to deploy to Iraq or earthquakes in Haiti, I'll have to go. So that does not solve our human capacity problem. And Estonia has a model called the Cyber Defense League that allows civilians to aid government on a volunteer basis. The parallel in the United States is the Civil Air Patrol, which was actually created during World War II to fill gaps that the U.S. military couldn't meet. So it was doing things like submarine patrols to ferrying planes to teaching kids. And again, the parallel here for a cyber version of this is doing everything from red teaming to helping with incident response to, just like the Civil Air Patrol, reaching out to schools and universities to aid in training or to draw people in. So I think we need to be creative in building up other organizations that gap fill and do it in a very cheap manner. So if you look at the Civil Air Patrol, it's something like a budget of like 60 million. And again, I think there's a lot more that can be done in this space. But to go back to what Rob was laying out, the challenge for it is everyone can't think that they own this problem. And that's been one of the, for all the capability building at Cyber Command or within the National Guard, we've also seen a resistance to alternative structures that might aid more capacity building.
So I'm going to open this up to the floor in a second, but just before we do, I want to touch on that talent point. We have several examples of sort of the US military sort of cyber talent now doing its business in the private sector here on the panel, let alone in the audience and elsewhere. Firstly, how do we make sure we're generating the right talent in the private sector, in the military? And second, how do we make sure that it is deployed in the right place? Either all of the talent doesn't get sucked out into the private sector, or we're kind of trying to do things in the military that could be done better in the private sector.
Maybe we ought to think about this structurally a little bit differently. So we talk about talent moving from the military into the private sector. So maybe the way to look at it is to say, all right, so is that such a bad thing? And maybe we ought to look at the mission space, right? So, Cyber Command has 3 missions. As you know, it defends, it operates and defends the gig, and it does some other full spectrum, yak, whatever the euphemism of the day is. Maybe on the defensive side, we think about pushing a lot of that out of government, and we think about sending that, using the commercial sector to do much of that sort of blocking and tackling stuff, which would now free up assets and resources to use against some of the other missions that Cybercom might do. So there's just a couple different ways I think that we might be able to look at this in a little asymmetrically that might actually be useful.
Rob, I think that's your cue.
Yeah, so I would agree. I mean, I think we've seen this already where the various military services are talking about outsourcing certain aspects of IT to like Amazon. I think it makes a lot of sense. There are expertise that has become commoditized, that's scalable, and the private sector has knowledge on how to do, and I think we should think about the problem differently, because there is a role for everybody, and there's a lot of smart talent, as mentioned, and we just kind of have to play to those strengths. When I think of workforce development specifically for the government, I don't really push back on like weight changes. Like, I'm a fairly fluffy guy after I got out, and I still don't think that anybody should welcome me back in uniform like this. Like, let's not change the military because we think cyber experts only come in one flavor. It's just not true. I would say there's a lot of adages, actually, that we cling to, and a lot of cliches that we cling to that are just not true. The attacker has to get it right once, but defenders have to get it right all the time. That's stupid and wrong. The idea that we can't detect novel attacks, so that's completely throwing away the idea of an investigation during a kill chain type of effect. There's all these things that we cling to. One of them that I constantly hear is, well, people are leaving the military because they get paid more in the private sector. And that's not why I left. It's not why most of my peers left. Most of the folks that I see leave because of mission. You can't have a lack of culture, a lack of mission, and a lack of pay. You know, pick one or two. But if you have all three, you're going to lose your folks. So when, I mean, and I'm in no way cynical. If you cut me, I still bleed red, white, and blue in coffee. But if you look at the military today, there's an overappreciation on capabilities and an underappreciation of people. That sort of pendulum swing is going to force you to lose a lot of people. There is consistently a focus on putting leadership as a skill. I don't know who started that on terms of like, well, he's a pilot, he should be in charge of cyber. Like, why? He has no skills for cyber. Well, he's a leader. That doesn't make any sense to your folks that are trying to come up the ranks. I wrote a paper years ago actually pushing back against Michael Daniel, no offense to Michael Daniel, when he came out and said, well, it's great that I had no technical capabilities, that it kept me out of the weeds. Well, you just de-incentivized everybody in that whole chain of people growing up to go get a business degree instead of cyber skills, because apparently that's what leadership looks like. And we gotta incentivize people differently. I think that's the workforce challenge the military is gonna have. Personnel and procurement system, fix those and you'll fix a lot of the challenges from pilots to cyber.
Jen, you recruit out of the military for your current role. How do you see the talent piece?
Yeah, on the leadership piece, I don't know if that's unique to Air Force.
It's very Air Force thing.
I had a different experience in the Army, so we don't need to go into that in detail, but I think leadership is, core to the importance of, across the branches of the Army. But to the point about the talent management piece, just to pick up on one thing you said, I don't necessarily think people are leaving, and I'm not just talking about military, and we can just choose to talk National Security Agency because we both have some background in that, but even civilians who are leaving for one reason or another, they're not leaving for the money necessarily, but the truth of the matter is the private sector does pay more money. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm getting at in terms of how do we look at personnel policies of if somebody does go out and work in the private sector, particularly in the critical infrastructure sector, which I think is, a good thing for the nation. It's part of our economic security with respect to finance. If we wanted them to come back in for one reason or another, or to be able to move back and forth, I think those are the types of things that we need to figure out how to crack the code on that. And so, but from a larger standpoint, I spend probably 60 to 70% of my time on talent management in my current job. When you think about it, negative percent unemployment for cybersecurity skills, to me, it comes down to sort of a little bit echoing what Rob just said about, culture. You didn't use that word, but I think it is creating the right culture, whether it be in the military or whether it be in the intelligence community or in the private sector, so that people feel incentivized to solve really tough technical problems, and let alone by good leadership to be able to do that, empowered to do it, so that they can take initiative and have their risks underwritten and be innovative. And also, I think what is really important, and we don't have a ton of time to talk about this, but is inclusion and diversity. I think to get to your question, Peter, it's start very young. Because getting to the elementary school, whether it's the Cyber Civilian Air Patrol or Cyber Peace Corps or Cyber Teach for America, we need to be able to tap into a much larger portion across all of our kids, to include young women. Because I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the data shows that more inclusive, more diverse organizations are more efficient, more productive, more effective. And so I spend a lot of my time figuring out how to make a more diverse organization. There's a great new book written by General Dempsey and Ori Brothman called Radical Inclusion, which actually talks about some of the things you said with a war of ideas. It's John Adams says, facts are stubborn things, but facts don't really matter that much anymore. It's all about the war for the narrative. Yeah. But the contention of the book is we can win the war of the narrative if we develop a more inclusive culture.
Thank you. I know other people have comments on that, but I'm going to open it up to the floor. If you have a question, please put your hand straight up, and we'll take 3 questions as a group. So let's start over here.
Good morning. I'm Colonel Scott Heath with the United States Air Force. We talked earlier about the ability or the lack of responses to any type of cyber attack. Do you think it's a matter or a challenge that it is becoming more difficult to ID the attacker, whether it be a non-state or a private entity, or is it more of a factor of risk averse because if you do get that wrong and you're able to ID, what's the challenge if it doesn't turn out to be what we thought it was?
Thank you. Well, we'll group these questions just so we have a chance. So, gentleman in the blue shirt towards the back.
Captain Robert Robinson, U.S. Army. I just had a question in particular. Everyone touched on either video manipulation or power grid and cybersecurity with financial, but I didn't hear anything in specific about supply chain management or logistics and how like false requisition would be a big issue on a global scale.
Thank you, and one at the front here.
Hi, Matt Ryan from the Council for Emerging National Security Affairs. You talked about the potential for private sector to contribute to these problems, but history has shown that private sector can't always impose the stick. So you talked about carrots, but there's not a stick. Richard Clarke used the comparison of an oil spill or an environmental disaster for how some of these vulnerabilities are being treated in the private sector. Isn't there a need for the government to step in and punish those who are needlessly creating vulnerabilities in this space?
So 3 questions. 1, identification of attackers, I guess attribution. 2nd, supply chain cybersecurity. And 3rd, the role of the government to sort of hold the private sector to account for vulnerabilities, but also, I guess, to enable them to do other things. Jump in as you see fit.
So if the question about attribution depends on who you talk to, it's either very difficult or not so very difficult. The response to that, in whether or not there is risk, it depends. One of the things that I think we ought to think about, though, is not necessarily thinking about responding to a cyber event with another cyber event. That we ought to think about responding to a cyber event by any means that we deem necessary, which obviously gives you more attack surface, it gives you a more asymmetric approach, and that's really, I think, what you're after. Part of the issue that you're raising, though, at least in my experience, has been that a lot of the people that are trying to make decisions about the actions or the reaction to something that's happened have not taken the time to educate themselves in even the basic technology to understand exactly what it is that's happening to them, to their networks, to their infrastructure. And I'm not talking about making computer scientists out of them. I'm simply talking about actually having them come to the level where they can understand this. I don't know what you do in the Air Force, but if you're a pilot, for example, not every pilot that I know, certainly I'm not, is an aeronautical engineer. Yet we all have some basic understanding of aerodynamics and why airplanes do the things that they do. That level of understanding with regard to cyber in the world of cyber is something that I've seen to be sort of spotty, I guess.
I'll take the supply chain question. We need to reframe our thinking. Our supply chain is now a battlefield. And it's a battlefield in at least 2 potential ways. One is if you look at the scenarios, whether it's Russia in Eastern Europe or China in the Pacific, there's power in a direct defeat, but there's also power in just simply slowing down our deployment enough to create a fait accompli. I seize territory X or I take action Y, and the United States doesn't show up within the day, it's delayed for a week or the like. And going after our supply chain, going after the civilian companies that our military depends on to deploy, going after GPS, not just to make the Navy ship think that it's in the wrong place, but to make the package hit the wrong place. Changing the package so that instead of ammunition, toilet paper arrives by the barcode. All of that has an effect that could shift the battle and allow the other side to win simply by delaying the normal, efficient workings of our supply chain. The second idea of it being a battleground is hitting the supply chain during the design or manufacturing process. that is creating flaws in the technology itself. So we've seen stealing of intellectual property, but you may also see the insertion of flaws, hardware hacks, so to speak, so that those microchips that you bought on scale and then deployed into your weapons on scale, what happens when they don't work the way that you planned? And again, what hits, I think a theme of this is that battle, the effect of it might happen 2 years from now, but the most important battle happened in phase 0. That is, the war might have been won 2 years before the war ever began.
Jen, Rob?
Yeah, I was really going to mention what Peter mentioned. I talked about NotPetya earlier, which is a great example of a supply chain attack that had hundreds of millions of dollars of impact and rippled, operationalized through MEDOC accounting software. So couldn't agree more that that's another sort of major trend, and we certainly look at, from a vendor perspective, that's as important as our weakest point, frankly. To your point about regulation and legislation and all that, I would just comment, if you look at some of the things that the SEC is doing to specifically hold corporations accountable, potentially related to coming out of the Equifax, the way that Equifax dealt with their breach, I think they are looking to basically inflict or to, I don't want to use the word inflict, sort of create greater incentives for the private sector to be able to be more active in terms of dealing with vulnerabilities. And then also the GDPR, which will go into effect in May, has a real impact in terms of corporations and firms that operate outside the US in terms of how we deal with privacy. And so another example of just how we're going to be, how we're going to need to shift what we do based on government norms.
So we're pretty much at the end of the time, so I'm going to ask Rob to come in and just answer those 3 questions, and then I'm going to put you on warning that I'm going to come down the row and ask each of the panelists for the 1-sentence view of what the US needs to do differently to be ready for the challenges the next decade.
This is obviously going to be much shorter. So knowing the attacker, not important at all for defense. It's important for strategic purposes. If I'm doing instant response or investigations, it can actually hurt the baggage that comes with attribution and thinking differently in the network. 99% of your instant response is before the attack happens. It's all the preparatory work and the investigations capital that needs to be put in. Therefore, under any model, people showing up to site to fix it after the fact is always a losing strategy. On the discussion of supply chain, still not a use case for blockchain. If we are going from identifying where it came from, where it went, you still use digital hashing. The whole discussion is much broader than security of it. I think they hit it very well with the supply chain aspect of our suppliers and being attacked by foreign governments. I was actually very happy to see 7 leading nations come out and do attribution on the NotPetya attack and talk about economic sanctions, something different than a cyber attack, back at them. I do think that imposes great costs. On the security of our supply chain, that's where government has a role. Software downloading and hashing it to make sure it's validated, any company can do that. Knowing that the Cisco router didn't get intercepted along the way before it went to your facility, there's a really good role for government to be involved in that. On the aspect of regulations, make sure that you are setting a base standard. It's hard to define what base looks like. The idea, though, is to always make sure it's incentivized and community structure more so than punishment. The moment you utter the word punishment and regulation, you're going to have better lobbyists on the other side. So when it comes to regulation, figure out what we need to set as a base and understand that any level of regulation can't regulate away future problems. It can only help us be more defensible against the problems we know about.
Okay, 1 sentence is all you're allowed. What is the one thing we ought to do to prepare for the next decade? Rob?
It has to absolutely be focused on workforce development. People are always going to be your best portion of this.
Jen?
It'll be boring and say continue to invest in human capital because it's the most important thing that we can do.
Cool, thank you. Bob?
So the one thing that we don't do well is we don't teach critical thinking skills in this country. And Marie and I were at a conference last week, and a professor from Columbia had just done a study on fake news and where it was coming from, right? It was the target audience, the biggest offenders were 65 years of age and older, and they were getting their news through Facebook. So critical thinking isn't something you just learn in school and then forget about. It's something that you probably ought to remember as you get older. But again, I understand memory's not quite as good, so maybe that's why it happened.
Peter, final word.
Lightly tapping someone's wrist that has already been lightly slapped will not change the lesson that Russia and every other actor out there took, that cyber attacks on the United States and its allies are incredibly low cost, high gain.
Thank you very much. Before I go, I want to give a quick plug to pick up Jen's point about women in cybersecurity inclusion for New America's Humans of Cybersecurity blog. We're very focused on this issue. We'd like to give more visibility to that. And date yet arranged, but I want to invite you all to come to the event that I know we must organize between Rob Lee and our blockchain trust accelerator, which will come up sometime in the next few months. But for now, I'd like to thank Rob Lee, Jen Easterly, Bob Schmidl, and Peter Singer. Thank you very much.
We're going to keep rolling here. We've got another honored guest coming onto the stage, General Stephen Wilson, who is the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and he will be joined by Peter Singer, who is just on stage. So we kindly ask that you either return or remain in your seats for this next discussion. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to ask you if you can to take your seat because we're going to start again. We run a tight ship here on trying to keep on schedule. So as we begin, I want to thank General Wilson for joining us. A little bit of background on him. He is a command pilot with more than 4,500 flying hours and 680 combat hours supporting operations Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, and Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa. Prior to his current assignment as Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, he was Deputy Commander of U.S. Strategic Command. So he brings a very diverse set of experiences to the table, and so I want to use that as a way of opening up with the first question, where I'd like to ask you to take the long view. What will be the same and what will be different in air warfare 10 years out? So it's 2028. What is the same? What is different?
Yeah, Peter, maybe I even switch the question a little bit and say it's going to be bigger than air warfare. So I think, the general nature of war in many ways won't change, but I think fundamentally the nature of war will change in exponential ways. And let me articulate just a second. So I think you've heard us talk about trans-regional, multi-domain, multi-component, both urban and connected, and speed is what's going to be different. I talk about today being a transformative time for our nation, that we're going through a period of disruption politically, economically, socially, and technologically, and that's happening globally. Any one of those areas are tough, but when you combine all four of those together, I think it makes for exponential disruption. Leading that on the bottom is this technological piece. That we've seen this pace of change that's just going nearly vertical, right? And just look today, what's happening? 5G wireless, you connect the devices. We think there's in the neighborhood of 30 billion connected devices. That changes lots of things. So what I used to say is in the industrial age, we won industrial age speed, won yesterday's war. Digital age speed, won tomorrow's war. And that's what actually the Air Force is really pretty good about, speed. We say speed wins, and whether it's speed of delivery of relief supplies after a hurricane or whether we're protecting the homeland, owning the high ground of air and space, projecting combat power forward, speed in training, speed in preparation, speed in developing capabilities, speed wins. So what I see changing is those multi-domain, multi-component, urban and connected, trans-regional fights that are going to happen, and it won't just be an air piece. We'll be connected to all those.
So one of the aspects that speed drives is a push to a topic that we've already hit on in a couple of panels today, and we're definitely going to hit on others, is machine learning, artificial intelligence. The idea that the machine can take in more information and or make a decision quicker than the human can. And we've seen that in everything from stock markets to it's being explored in warfare. And I want to pull that thread a little bit further and connect it to work that we've had going on here at New America and our DigiChina and Eastern Arsenal projects that look at the fact that artificial intelligence is a key new area for the economy, a key new area for war, but the United States has competitors in it. And in particular, China's have been doing a huge amount of work. So what do you see as the applications for AI within the Air Force? And then secondly, what are you doing to make sure that you keep pace or don't fall behind or stay ahead, however you want to frame it? What do you do with the fact that we have a competitor in a way that we haven't seen in the last generation technologically when it comes to AI?
Yeah. Well, we'd say there certainly are the competitors out there. We talk frequently with Eric Schmidt and the Defense Innovation Board as they come and tell us the things that they're doing and look at what we're doing. They're helping us. One example is Project Maven. So to set the record straight, what we're doing with Project Maven is we're trying to take things that are routine, processing of pictures, and how can I do that better? And Eric would tell me, you may have an Intel analyst, and after some period of time of training, he or she can get it right 75% of the time. He said, I have average computers that can look through 1,000 pictures a minute with 99% accuracy. So how could I leverage this human-machine teaming and let computers do what computers are good at, and let humans do what humans are good at, and then to figure out the insights and the why and the analysis versus repetitive tasks that I have people joining on today about. But it is, make no debate on this where artificial intelligence is heading. So I've been traveling around, listening to some folks, going to some of our great academia universities. Was out at Carnegie Mellon recently and seeing some of the work that they're doing, seeing what our industry partners are doing. But I think it's going to take all of us working together across academia, across industry, across the departments, across all the national labs and FFRDCs, and bringing that together in this competition with AI, because that's in fact what China's doing. So if you look at what companies like Alibaba or Beidou or Tencent are doing, they're investing a lot of money, and they're using a whole of nation approach for it. Right? So we're going to have to compete to win, and that again, that's where I think we can come together across the different areas, bring those together to stay in the lead in artificial intelligence and machine learning.
In your career, did you ever have to deal with an adversary that had better technology?
I haven't. Now, I'd tell you that we've got adversaries today that can take technology that we wouldn't normally think about as being cutting edge and do things with it and adapt it in ways that we didn't expect. And I'll use an example from a couple years ago when I was visiting my counterpart in Canada, and I had an assignment there. We were catching up about kids. And he said his son was going to college in King's College, and he was getting a degree in mechanical engineering, but he goes, he's not really interested in that. He's really interested in FPV. And I said, what is that? I don't know what you're talking about. He said, well, it's first person view. And I said, okay, I still don't know what you're talking about. He goes, oh, it's where kids, it's a rage on college campuses where kids are putting on augmented reality headsets and they're racing their UAVs. While they're in this dorm room, they're racing their UAVs in the auditorium. Well, I started Googling it, and it blew my mind what's going on. Well, that today is a transition to the Middle East, right? And so now that's what people like ISIS do today. They don't have to buy a MQ-1 or an MQ-9. They can buy a DJI Phantom 4 made in China, which has got a 4K resolution camera, and they can use it to command and control. They can use it to do things that we didn't think like that, and it's a $1,000 piece of equipment. Right, so that's where this is another what I call the quadruple convergence. Right, so we've got this technology that can make capability with global access, and often can be put in the hands of malicious intent. And so that's where we have to think differently about this challenge going forward.
I want to connect two things you brought up. So we talked about AI, and then you mentioned the difference between MQ1, MQ9, and an important moment happened in kind of future of war history this last year. So we saw the retirement of the MQ1, we poured one out for the Predator drone, and we moved to MQ9. What is the future of what the Air Force lovingly calls RPAs, what the rest of us call drones? What does it look like when it comes to autonomy? And to maybe make it a little bit more pointed, General McConville from the Army side earlier today told us that a human will always be in the loop. What does in the loop look like for the Air Force in the future when it comes to RPA, UAS, drone, whatever we want to call it? Where is the human role? What are they doing? Flesh out what it means to be in the loop.
Yeah, so we're exploring with our research lab what that looks like in autonomous operations. And does that mean one individual is now controlling 3 or 4 or 5 or some number of autonomous vehicles rather than just one, or a couple people controlling just one? So how do we take this, again, human-machine teaming? How can we do things to where I can take advantage of autonomous systems that can help sense and report back? And again, I'm going through my little mindset of what the future looks like, and I think it looks a little bit like this. There's certainly a data aspect piece of this, and I think we all would agree maybe that data is the new oil of the 21st century. But with that data, I got to be able to have the right algorithms that connect the data and understand the data to a network. I think the cloud's a part of this. And I think compute on the edge is a part of this. And how do I do enhanced capabilities on the edge so that I don't have to have big pipes everywhere? But I think that this, as we look at that network that connects cloud to edge, that connects the data and the algorithms, that's where we're now looking at how we do that, how do we rapidly experiment and prototype with capabilities, using those attributes moving forward.
So I want you to do a little bit of Imagineering for us. So you laid out a vision for the future Air Force, cloud, computing on the edge, and the like. What does an adversary do in response to that? So, we develop long-range strike. They develop surface-to-air missiles. There's always the back and forth. Mm-hmm. What do you expect the counters to be to the future Air Force that you're building?
Yeah. So I need to have an agile network to be able to. We're putting a lot of emphasis. You've heard General Goldfein talk about multi-domain operations and how do I build a next generation OODA loop, the OODA loop 2.0, that is able to sense globally, understand the situation, and then provide effects across multiple domains at time and scale and place that our adversaries can't keep up with. So with that, I need to build a network that connects from geosynchronous orbit all the way to subsurface, all of our different platforms. So here's a vision that I think about. We see people driving Teslas. Every Tesla is networked to every other Tesla. So if a Tesla is driven on the road in front of you and hits a pothole, you know that pothole's there. And if the Tesla's in the auto mode, it will avoid that pothole. If it's in the self-driving mode, it will actually adjust the suspension on the car to take into account that pothole. Well, if I can do that for a Tesla, then can I do that for, let's say, maybe a tank, an MRAP, a Humvee, a ground vehicle? If I can do it there, can I do that same thing in the air? Can I connect all the air vehicles so that they're passing information, relevant information about threat, adversary, and build an operating learning system? Can I do that same thing in space? And then can I connect space to air, to ground, to surface, to subsurface? So having a resilient network that's sharing information is what we're going to try and drive to, because I think an adversary is going to try and deny us information, or there's something maybe we talked about at dinner last night, when we start doubting the truthfulness, the trust of the information, and it puts the fog and friction in there, weaponizing that information to make sure so you know what truth is, will be important in the future.
So you brought up space. What is the space environment, space domain? What do battles look like? What does the Air Force look like in 2028 when it comes to space? What is it doing? Who's in charge? How is it training for it?
Yeah, great points. So we're having lots of space discussions across the nation. What I think is really healthy about it is we're all in alignment. From the White House to Congress to OSD, Joint Staff, allies, partners, industry, about we have our Space Force today is the envy of the world. Right? The United States Air Force is responsible for 90% of that. But we also know our adversaries have also seen that and seen that space is essential for any joint warfight. Whether it be indications of warning, whether it be missile alert, whether it be communication, whether it be GPS, down the list of capabilities that it provides our nation. So we need to be able to defend space. So space is a contested domain, and we need to, A, understand that, and then look at how would I provide the capabilities in the past where it wasn't, right? So I don't want to go to space, but I also need to have the ability to defend my assets in space. So we're going to build a force that does just that. We're looking at everything from the bottom end, how do I train space operators? And General Jay Raymond out of Space Command is working really hard on building this space mission force that understands the environment and is able to think warfighting through the buildup of our operators. And the other part is how do we acquire space capabilities faster? Lots of effort in that endeavor from the Deputy Secretary of Defense, keen interest in how do I, again, build capabilities faster, how do I partner with industry, how do I push down milestone decision authorities, how do I use things like other transactional authorities, how do I do things like we've done in the Rapid Capabilities Office for space, to bring on space capabilities much faster. So that's what we're doing. We're building a defendable architecture. Certainly industry, commercial, our allies and partners are a part of this, but the other key part of this is how essential space is to all of us in the joint warfight.
So I'm going to tug at this a little bit more. I'm not going to let you get away with this. So in 2028, what does the U.S. Satellite architecture look like? Is it lots of small, cheap satellites, or is it a small number of capable, exquisite ones?
Yeah, Peter, I tell you, it's maybe both. I mean, we're looking through that right now.
Can we afford both?
Good. Maybe. And again, here's the maybe part of that, right? It's are you designing something to last for 20 years, or are you designing something to last for 5 years? And there's a big price point difference in how you do that.
So if we're in 2028, we've got to make that decision now. So which do we do?
We're starting to make, we're working through understanding that and getting buy-in and consensus across all our different departments on what that exactly looks like. And I think there'll be a mixture of both. I think we'll, again, look at what commercials doing today and the different companies that are going to do internet, 1,000 constellation internet. We need to be part of that. Look at what folks like Planet Lab are doing. They're doing things differently with small sats, right? I think we'll be part of that. I also think capabilities to do some of the things that we need to do aren't going to be like that. They're going to be bigger, more costly, and we need to be able to protect and defend those. So it's a combination of both.
What does space warfare look like in 2028? Is it as now, where I'm using assets in space to communicate or look down? So it's part of the battle space, but there's no conflict there? Or in 2028, is there actual conflict there, and what does it look like? Is it, I'll let you fill in the blanks.
So, you probably heard General John Hyten. I think he's got a great answer to this. He goes, there's no such thing as space war. There's war, right? And an adversary is going to try and deny us the capabilities that we're going to rely on to be able to win. And the joint team, the joint force, needs to have space as a big part of that equation today on what we do globally, and to be able to do the things that I talked about earlier on a global scale. I need to be able to have the ability to sense, observe, act, and decide on a time scale faster than our adversaries, and that today that requires space. And everything from, like I said, from GPS for our precision navigation and timing, to our communication, to our sensing it's going to require space. So what does it look like? We have to be able to protect it, defend it, and we have to be able to deter in space. So there's no real easy answer on this. What does it look like? I think that any adversary is going to look at how reliant we are on our capabilities and try and affect that. And that's why we're working hard to defend space is one of the big efforts moving forward.
So let's go nuclear. It's 2028. What does the B-21, I don't want to ask what it looks like, what does the B-21 program look like at that point, 10 years out from now?
10 years out from now, we'll have taken delivery of our first models there. We'll be producing them hopefully at a nice clip. 2 years after the initial operating capability of the airplane, we will have nuclear certified it, and so we'll have a capability to have a dual capable platform in our B-21. I just went out with the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Northrop team, and we did a one-day deep dive on the B-21, and we're in the preliminary design phase, and it's coming along very well, we think. We've got a good team, both government and industry, on this program. It's really important to all of us, so we're spending time really deep diving in, and Secretary Shanahan wanted to go out and get an immersion in that, and that's what we did. We're needing to balance that, though, and I just, because I always get asked the question about the transparency on the B-21. And I want to make sure that we're as transparent as we can possibly be with those cleared members of Congress and their staff who we have shown all the details on the B-21. We're balancing that with making sure our adversaries don't learn things in advance of what we're trying to, for operational security, to not let them know. And so that's where the balance becomes on the B-21.
Okay. So the general's been very kind to agree to do something a little bit different, which is we're now going to have a Twitter lightning round. And basically this weekend, I let social media know that I would be interviewing him and ask for questions from them. So we've got a series of questions, and he's agreed to give answers in 200...
Less than 280 words.
Not words, characters. Big difference here.
Characters, right.
It's Twitter, not Facebook that we've learned, only a couple of old people will read.
Yeah.
Okay, so first question is from at Dan Suckman, which is, what is the future of CAS?
What is the future of CAS?
Close air support.
Close air support. I think it's an important mission set for our Air Force. We're going to continue to be invested in making sure we can protect our ground forces. It's kind of a moral obligation for us to be able to do that. We also have to be able to do it both contested all the way through, uncontested all the way through contested. And so we're developing capabilities that do just that. I'll use this. So it's important to us. Sorry, 280 characters, way too long.
You say CAS is important, and it's got to work contested and uncontested.
Yes.
Hashtag Air Force.
Hashtag Air Force.
Like,
I got it now.
Okay.
I'm on track now. Got it. Short answers, 280 characters. Important.
Okay, so the takeaway on that is contested and uncontested. Okay, so next one is from at Roly Poliolis. What kind of changes, if any, are needed to Air Force spending and acquisitions, both in process and priorities?
We need to change how we do requirements, how we do acquisition, contracting, budgeting, and testing. Speed wins. I got to compress the timeline. Hashtag speed wins.
All right. At KW Collins, should there be a separate Space Force? Why or why not?
More to follow. We think we have a good, the world's greatest Space Force today. We're going to make it even better.
Okay, similar one from at Fleischer_P. What kind of new space assets should the U.S. develop to counter China and Russia?
What kind of new space assets? We need to have defendable space assets and a resilient architecture that can continue to make sure we dominate in space in 2028.
Okay, this was my personal favorite of all of them. At KJ Deggs, will the Air Force ever replace ellipticals and vending machines with enough squat racks to actually get a leg day in? Or is the Air Force all doomed to chicken legs at the base gym?
I think he's talking about my legs. He's seen me at the gym, my chicken legs. Change chicken legs, note.
Okay, so it's clearly an Air Force officer. All right. Okay, at J Byerly 81, as other countries invest in AI and drone development to increase the speed at which decisions are made, how will the U.S. Air Force keep pace?
Yeah, we're going to not only keep pace, but dominate in how we do that. It's going to take a whole of government approach to this. Industry, academia, national labs in our department working together. Hashtag speed wins.
Okay, we've got some tough questions here. At Joe Plinsler, why did U.S. Air Force leadership severely limit press engagement? What responsibilities do service chiefs have to communicate with taxpayers?
Yeah, we want to be transparent as we possibly can with the American public. We did not limit communication. What we wanted to do is make sure all of our folks understand operational security and making sure we're not giving adversaries advantages that they don't need to have.
Okay. At Frantic Goat, the U.S. Air Force and the A&G have evaluated A-29 and/or the AT-6C nearly half a dozen times in the past decade. How can the U.S. Air Force need more data before deciding how to proceed on its latest light attack program?
Yeah. So we're doing an exercise this summer with both airplanes. We want to understand the maintenance required, the number of people required, the support logistics infrastructure to be able to do that. And then we think we'll be able to make a decision in the fall to take a program that would normally take years to buy, and from idea to buying an airplane under 3 years. Hashtag speed wins.
All right. F. Fletch Williams, how is contracting to private companies balanced with maintaining appropriate national security checks and limitations to information access?
Yeah. We need to look hard at how we do getting the right access for the right people at the right time, but also this operational security piece behind that. We've had lots of challenges with lots of clear defense contractors that information has gotten out. That's got to change. We've got to figure out how we do that differently.
Okay, so let's take it from cyberspace back to human or meat space, and we're going to take questions from here. So please raise your hand, wait for the mic to come, and identify yourself. Right there. Nope. Right there, yeah.
Hi, General Wilson. This is Oriana Pollack from military.com. Thanks for doing this. I wanted to see if you had any comments regarding the hike in aviation accidents, the report that's out there from Military Times this morning. Talking about the future, talking about readiness, but what about the right now, that the spike has been seen, that there has been some, grave indifference on what's been going on out there in aviation? I mean, could you comment regarding what the Air Force's portion of that is and how you plan to build up that readiness so, fatal accidents do not occur?
Yeah. Well, let me set the record straight. Any accident and any Class A accident is one too many. And we spend a lot of time making sure that we have the safest program that we possibly can. For those who don't know, when we talk Class A's, we talk as a dollar figure or a loss of life. So our safest year ever was 2014. 2017 was our second safest year. So our Class A mishaps have been trending down. What's been trending up and was reported was our Class C mishaps, and those are lower category mishaps, lower dollar figure, but still a concern to all of us. And so we've got our safety professionals digging into it, seeing if there's any noticeable trends that we have in our Class C mishap rates. But to your broader question of readiness, we're intensely focused on improving readiness. We brought together a team of about 50 people. We sequestered them in the Pentagon for 6 weeks, and we looked at readiness through the lens of what can we do to drive the readiness of the Air Force faster and move the timeline left. I used to say, how long does it take to make an 8-year Master Sergeant? And that's about how long it's going to take us to improve our readiness. We think we can do it faster. We're going to look at how do we target specific squadrons with the right both people, with the right experience mix, with the right flying hours and infrastructure to be able to support pacing squadrons to move the readiness needle left. But we've had a very big team looking at it. We've briefed it up to the leadership. I think they are all really can see the efforts that we're making like the trajectory that we're on to improve our readiness.
Okay, so we got the middle. Let's go to the left here in the front, right here.
Thank you, Patrick Tucker with Defense One. The pushback from the Google developer community about the Project Maven partnership has certainly caught Google off guard. I wonder if you could tell us what's the most important lesson learned for the Air Force from that now very public pushback, and has it affected the way the Air Force is working Project Maven, and has it affected any potential future partnerships with Google or similar firms?
Yeah, I guess the lesson learned is to make sure we're all understand the right side picture. We're using, it's a department effort with OSD, which the Air Force is a part of, to be able to look at how do we automate things, that the repetitive tasks that humans spend a lot of times doing, that machine learning can do differently. So today we're looking at how do I look through full motion video and be able to determine, is that a car, is that a person, is that a house? That's what the Project Maven effort is in doing. To be able then to turn around and say, make sure that people understand what it's not, right? It is not weaponizing, it's not using machines in a targeting function. We're fully compliant with all the US regulations, policies, and laws, and that we've had industry partnered with us moving forward. And we continue, we're gonna need industry. All of us are gonna need industry to help us moving forward as we, again, compete, deter, win on this new national defense strategy. And our industry partners have been very helpful in this. Bottom line learned is communication and being able to, people to understand the message of what exactly we're trying to do moving forward.
Let's get someone on the right here. Anyone? Yeah, right there.
I'm Mike Kinger. I'm a defense fellow with Congressman Rob Bishop. Sir, we talked a lot about in 2028 about systems we'll bring online to face our adversaries, but what about talent management, making sure we're recruiting the right people, retaining the right people in a very competitive job market who have very marketable skills to be able to fight our wars in 2028?
Yeah, that's a really important question. We're all in this hunt for talent, every one of us. And so we have to find ways to reduce the barriers from people. You see them like I do. I get to go out and meet these folks, our young people that are just simply amazing, right? So I got to find a way to make it easy for them to come into service, and then to be able to have this transportability through the different services or agencies who want to be part of it. I was telling a story backstage when I'll call the 4 great captains. Here's an example. So at our squadron officer school, the commandant asked for a Shark Tank-like event with ideas. And he said, the best idea will get to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Unfortunately, the Chief was gone that day, and I got to listen to their idea. First of all, their idea was unbelievable. Today, I'm going to go visit here at the end of the week. They're up in Boston doing a tech accelerator to help us on a really challenging problem set. I called them the 4 great captains. Here's an example of one of the captains. And they were all of this caliber. He got his degree from Rensselaer Polytech. He then went to the Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center. They recognized his talent. They sent him to MIT to get his PhD. While he was at MIT getting his PhD, he got his MBA from Harvard on the side. And while he did that, he set up a venture capital company that was named as one of the top 100 venture capital companies in America. These 4 captains were spending 50 hours a week in their spare time on this problem because they were really passionate about doing this and fixing a problem, right? I got to unleash that talent that exists all over. And what I've seen is these young people at all these universities, they've got energy and passion. They want to make a difference. So I got to find a way to make it easy for them to come in and serve. And then based on their life conditions and what's going on, they may need to take a break and go do something else. But then I got to make it really easy for them to come back in. And this is a really important question for the whole government, right? How do we do this so we reduce the barriers for entry, And then how do we make it easy so people who want to serve can serve?
So in these examples where there's a Shark Tank or there's something really interesting that comes out of one of the warfighting labs or the like, the story that then's often told is really cool idea and then it died somewhere along the valley of death. What changes need to happen? There's obviously policy changes that you can undertake, but there's also legal changes. There's a need for legislation. What are the types of legislation or legal changes that you see are needed to make more of these innovative ideas survive the valley of death and become programs of record?
So here's an example. So as we do the typical requirements process now, and I sit on the JROC with General Selva, who chairs it, we go through a process, and I'm going to call it the capability-based assessment, to initial capabilities document, to analysis alternatives, to a CDD, before I get a milestone decision on a program, right? That time period can take years, right? In many cases, 5 to 8 years to go through that piece, right? Way too long, right? So I've got to be able to do a experiment, to a rapid prototype, to say, is that good enough, and can I make a milestone decision here to move forward? And so I'd say it's almost going back to what we used to do in the late 50s and the 60s with the Century Series fighters. Of, right, how can I put out capability, different capability that's modified every 3 to 5 years with a pipeline and an industrial base behind that? We haven't been doing that, right? So I think we have to get back to that on the requirements piece, where we have to change it. We also have to change how we do the acquisition piece. We got lots of people focused on that. We haven't hit the contracting piece, right? I can't take 2 years to get something on contract. I can't take 4 or 5 years to test something, right? It will be obsolete before it's fielded, because at the end of that, I put it in the hands of somebody who can do something with it, and I got to train the operators, right? And so I've got to get on this pace and scale of capability development and go from what we've currently been doing for the last 20 plus years and shrink that down to a timeline that's 1/4 than what we've been doing in the past.
Okay, let's give someone in the back a chance to ask a question. Yeah, right there in the white. Yeah.
Hi, General Wilson. Rachel Karras with Inside the Air Force. So the Air Force recently said that it's looking at keeping the U-2 until 2100. And you're also, working on ways to keep...
Sorry, to be clear, 2100, like a century from now?
Correct.
That's...
Let me make sure, keeping the B-52?
No, the U-2.
U-2.
Yeah, Dragon Lady. But you're also looking at ways to keep the RQ-4 on par with that. So I'm curious, now that you're looking at SLEPing Global Hawk, are you trying to keep them on the same timeline? What is your plan for Global Hawk as that whole sort of high altitude enterprise moves forward?
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody's ever come online and saying we're keeping the U-2 till 2100. I certainly haven't. What we do think is we need this high altitude capacity, both from the RQ-4 and the U-2 today. And so it's a capacity issue. So I need both of them to do the type of things to be able to provide the information they provide on a global scale. So we're trying to get the sensors right between each different platform. We've got lots of service life left on the U-2, and we certainly have got plenty of service life left on the RQ-4. But I think it's a capacity issue of which we need both.
Okay, let's get a couple more questions right here. And in between, I really want to know the conflict scenarios in the year 2100. Will the U-2 be operating against the Arturi Empire and the like?
Hi. So my question is, how do you deal with the ethics of autonomous weapons?
Well, it's all of us. I think something we need to be thinking through. Right? If the Army Vice Chief said it, I'll probably be the guy that repeats it. That we think there's a human in the loop on all things. We're not going to have autonomous weapons where we say just go do what you. But I think we need to think through that question that you just asked about how much autonomy, where do we provide the autonomy. But make no mistake that the world, in the world that we're moving in the world that this transformation that's happening in technology, artificial intelligence and machine learning will be a key part of lots of things that we do. It's impacting every part of our life. and certainly impacting us here in the military. So how do we do, again, what machines are really good at? How do I team with humans, what humans are really good at? How do I keep a person in the loop and define what is in the loop? And to provide again, to me, it's the insights and the understanding and the why and for the what that machines can help provide us with. But it's an important question I think we all need to be thinking through.
I want to pin you down a little bit more on this. In the human in the loop, say in air-to-air combat, is the human decision making to shoot or not the way it is with RPA operations right now, where the plane may be able to operate in some way, shape, or form on its own, but it's going to be the human deciding to pull the trigger or not? Or is it the way we do, for example, air defense, where there is the potential for the machine to operate, identify, and the like, and the human can veto it, but it will operate without them? Which is it? Because the human is in the loop in both.
Yeah.
But they're
so I think we'll have to learn both ways, and we'll have to experiment both ways and what that means. And just as you use as an air defense capability, where there's things that we have to have. There's a set of rules of engagement. Are they squawking the appropriate squawk? Are they on the right altitude? Are they in the right corridor? Are they doing this? If not, somebody's there to veto it, right? So there'll be a series of rules of engagement that we'll have to be able to follow and understand on both sides of that equation moving forward.
Given the emphasis you earlier had on speed, can a human stay within that OODA loop 2.0, or will it definitionally be inhuman?
We don't know. We're gonna all understand as we start to do more experimenting, prototyping, and understanding that exact question.
We've got time for one last question, and I'm going to abuse it by asking one more, but hopefully be a useful one for all of you. What scenario keeps you up at night?
I sleep like a baby. Okay, so I would say we're taking the General Mattis approach.
Okay, when you wake up in the morning and go...
I'm keeping the General Mattis approach. I want our adversaries to stay up at night thinking about what we're doing, right? That's what I want to have happen. There's a couple areas that I think that I need to sharpen the focus maybe on, maybe two or three. One is we talk about moral obligations of our Air Force, that I got to be able to provide the right organization, training, equipment, and leadership for any of our young airmen that we send forward, right? Our job is to equip them to be able to do their mission, and that they're well led on that mission. So that to be able to do that across the range of capabilities that our Air Force has is a moral imperative for us. The second piece is, to this question over here, is about talent management. We've got some incredible people today, and so you've heard our Secretary of the Air Force and our Chief talk about how do we empower them. How do we remove the barriers and the obstacles for their success so that we have this little simple little model that I go through in my mind. We start with really good people. We then make sure they got the right education, training, experience. They're confident and proud of what they do. They're personally and professionally fulfilled. And when we do that, we get mission success. And if I remove any one of those pieces, then people invariably will not continue to serve. So I got to do all those pieces so that we've got the right talent moving our Air Force forward. And I contend, we've got a big study going away that I didn't talk about that talks, it's an S&T review. But what we want is our Air Force to be the thought leaders for future conflict so that we can compete, deter, and win in any future fight. And so developing those thought leaders for our nation who are going to help us in these future fights is really important. And we've got a lot of efforts and focus on how do we do that and how do we do that better.
So I want to thank you for a couple of things. The first is in a time of where there's controversy over engagement between civilian military, media military, you've sat down and taken roughly 40 questions from us and 40 tough questions on everything from future of war to Air Force gyms. So we deeply appreciate that, but we also appreciate the way that you've injected a lot of key issues for us to chew on, both in the conference ahead, but also the year ahead in this program. So please do join me in a round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. We'll be back here ready to go at 11:15. So get a cup of coffee, and we will see you soon. Thank you.